Hui Maine, welcome to the Finance and Performance meeting for November. I will call for Sandra to do the roll call because we're pretty light on the ground, I think.
Okay, we have Councillor Collins on the line and we have...
quietly, please.
We have apologies from Councillor Hills for absence on council business, Mayor Goff for absence on council business between 11:20 and 12:30, Councillor Filipina and IMSB Chair David Taipari for absence, Councillors Henderson, Walker and Watson for lateness.
Thank you very much. I move those apologies. Do I have a seconder? Bren, thank you. Sorry, Councillor. All those in favour say aye, against carried. I'd like to move the electronic attendance of Councillor Collins. Do I have a seconder, Councillor Casey? Thank you. All those in favour say aye, against carried. Any declarations of interest? With there be none, I'll move on to the confirmation of minutes, and we have 3 sets of minutes to confirm today. We have one ordinary meeting, open and confidential, from the 17th of September, an extraordinary meeting, open and confidential, on the 1st of October, and an extraordinary meeting, open and confidential, on the 22nd of October. I'll move those minutes, and I have a seconder from Councillor Cooper. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against carried. We have no petitions, we have no public input, we have no local board input, and we have been advised of no extraordinary items. I will now move to item 8, which is the Auckland Council Group and Auckland Council quarterly performance reports to the 30th of September, noting this is the legal requirement quarterly reports we've been doing. Thank you, Councillor. We've been doing month by month, as you know, because of the emergency budget. But I'll now call to the table Ross Tucker, John Bishop, Francis, Nicola to present. Thank you.
Pramod instead of Ross.
Oh, sorry, Pramod, you're instead of Ross. Good morning, team.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Through the chair. So, as Madam Chair has introduced, we're here to present the first quarter performance report for the group and also Auckland Council parent. The report covers both a summary of the financial performance for the quarter as well as an update on the group and Auckland Council strategic focus areas. So in terms of the group financial performance for the first quarter, in terms of capital performance, we've had really progress has continued quite well, even though we had delays with the adoption of the emergency budget. Overall capital investment for the first quarter was $575 million. That's an increase of 23 million, or 4% increase compared to the previous year for the same period. When compared to the budget for the current year first quarter, it is 65 million less, but it does equate to 90% of the budget being delivered in the quarter. Key budget variances contributing to the 65 million lower spend are related to capital expenditure for Auckland Transport and Auckland Council in the Customer and Community Division. The Auckland Transport lower expenditure is related to timing of when the electric trains were delivered, mainly due to the impacts of COVID. In Customer and Community, the driver for the variance is late adoption of the emergency budget, as well as local board work programs that were adopted in August, a month after the adoption of the emergency budget. The operating performance is also on track when compared to the emergency budget. We've had a positive first quarter with good revenue results. We've achieved budget and in fact 36 million favourable when compared with budget. The key drivers here are for Watercare IGC revenues have been performing very strongly. Just a reminder that some of that revenue is contributing to their contribution to the drought response-related CapEx, as they have a target of 121 million to achieve in relation to those capital costs. The remainder of the positive variance there is related to regulatory revenue, where consenting volumes have remained strong through the first quarter. Direct expenditure is tracking below budget, again a favourable result to date. Key variances again are related to late adoption of work programs in that first quarter, and also Auckland Transport, they've had less cleaning costs than was budgeted for COVID response, and also employee benefits expenditure is tracking 6 million below budget.
Thank you, Pramod. Look, this slide here gives a summary of our current debt situation. Current net debt on a group basis is 10.2 billion at the end of 30 September, so end of the first quarter. So we're tracking towards our year-end budget of 10.9 billion. Our net debt to total assets, that's a crude measure of our gearing, that sits at 17%. Now, there's a few accounting adjustments in there for the first quarter. We'd expect that to track back to pretty much 18% by year-end. As far as the key debt to revenue ratio, as outlined in the emergency budget, we expect that to peak at 290% as at the end of this financial year. And we only measure this typically on an annual basis. And it's fair to say at the moment there's nothing to indicate that we're going to be materially different from that figure of around 290%. And remember, that's against the current policy limit of 270%. And just to remind you, our credit ratings, AA from S&P, that was reaffirmed in September, and AA2, the equivalent rating from Moody's.
Our group FTEs have continued to reduce. At the end of the first quarter, the group had 174 decrease in FTEs when compared to 30th June 2020. Auckland Council FTEs have largely decreased due to attrition, so things like resignation, retirement and end of contracts, and also redundancy and tight recruitment controls. From the numbers you can see, a large part of the 174 decrease is made up of the contribution from Auckland Council's reduction in FTEs. Auckland Council's also established a redeployment team, which has been effective in filling necessary vacancies through internal transfers. Around 70% of vacancies have been filled internally, which has the benefit of being less disruptive to staff and minimises the potential of redundancy costs as well. RFA Ports and Panuku FTEs decreased mainly due to unfilled vacancies following restructures and recruitment freezes. And while Watercare's FTEs have increased partly due to recruitment of additional FTEs to help manage drought and its COVID-19 response, as well as filling prior year vacancies. There is some offset here in relation to costs though, as some of these FTEs, the work would have been carried out by contractors. So there is a shift there from moving from contractors or consultants into having in-house staff to do some of that work.
The slide over here we've included just to give confidence to the committee that the operating performance that we report from a management perspective actually does reconcile to what are in the statutory results, and included in the agenda are the Auckland Council Group Quarterly Statutory Results as Attachment C, which starts on page 53 of the agenda. And the important thing is that if you take the direct expenditure and the direct revenue, you do that calculation, it actually comes out back to the same number. So we just wanted to give you confidence that the information that we are providing to you does reconcile to the statutory, although we do take a direct expenditure, the controllable expenditure focus when we present to you the quarterly results.
Thanks, Francis. So I'm going to talk to the Auckland Council performance. I'll talk through the capital performance, then the operating results, and then we will have a feature segment from our regulatory services team. So we have spent 88 million in capital expenditure. That's 83% of our capital budget, and as Pramod mentioned earlier, it's a little bit behind because of the delays that we had in getting the emergency budget approved. Obviously that happened at the end of July, and then going through the process of local board work programs being agreed through August, but the program is starting to ramp up through September and continuing on. We have a couple of examples of projects that were completed in the first quarter. So we opened a new playground in Archibald Park in Kelston in September. This was bringing to life the park's concept plan. So this is community facilities work, which encompasses the detailed design, the obtaining of the required consents, procurement and management of the physical works. I don't know if you've been there, but it looks pretty fantastic. And another example that we have was the renewal of the assets at Onua Domain in Northcote. And that was quite substantial work around renewing all the fencing, rubbish bins, signage, lighting of the parking and sports fields, and also renewing roading and parking. Moving on to the operating performance, our operating results are favourable in the first quarter. And as Pramod noted, we've had, mainly in regulatory services, we've had higher revenue because our consenting volumes have not declined as we expected, and Craig and Ian will talk a bit more to that shortly. Our expenditure's also tracking just below budget. We've obviously got quite a substantial focus on the savings target, and we have continued controls around expenditure and recruitment. I'll hand over to David, who's going to talk to the non-financial performance.
Tēnā koutou, councillors. So I'll just run you through a few of the highlights and talk about the non-financial performance measures. First thing to note is we had a COVID-19 alert level 3 during the period in August. So, of course, that meant that we had to respond swiftly, and we did things like putting signage around our playgrounds to ensure that the public did not gather in those places. But we also supported local businesses, and we launched the Together We Can Support Local campaign during this period. And we also, during the second lockdown in August, ran a campaign to promote the key services and activities that Aucklanders could do from their homes. Now, I think that might have had a positive effect on things like library items that were borrowed. So if you have a look at visitation across our facilities, libraries, art and community venues, you'll see that pretty much across the board we were basically seeing half the visitation we'd normally expect to see. But when you look at the number of library items, for example, borrowed, we're actually above target, 3.8 million items versus what we expected, which was 3.5. So I'm hoping there's some correlation with our campaign to encourage people to use that services electronically and that good library borrowing number. The other crisis, of course, that we were managing is the drought response. We enabled access to over 25 million litres of non-potable water supplies. That was distributed through 12,419 visits to pick up that water. And of course, we've also removed resource consent fees for the installation of rainwater tanks at residential properties too. I've talked quite often in these updates about digital uptake. So we continue to see digital technology being embraced by our customers. Examples of that are that 85% of dog registrations are now done digitally. Last year that was 80%. And we've actually seen a 12% reduction in the number of face-to-face and phone requests for service. So you can see how customers are slowly picking up the digital interactions that we want. The other thing I wanted to note was around illegal dumping. So this was quite an issue about a year ago, as you all know. We're noticing that more and more people are reporting illegal dumping when it happens. But more encouragingly, we've noticed a decrease in the volume of things we pick up when we're going to collect illegally dumped things. So is good. More people are reporting illegal dumping, and we're seeing the kind of volumes drop. The last thing I want to just look at is media sentiment. Again, it's one of those longer run kind of measures, which is heading in the right direction. We've seen the media impact score rise from 51% in July to 54% in August. When you think of some of the things that we've had to deal with, COVID, the emergency budget, I think it's impressive that that has continued to rise, despite some of the messages that we've had to convey to the public being hard issues. So that's a positive trend too. I'll just move on to the overall performance metrics. Who's got the clicker? Great, thanks, Nicola. So if we just look across the entire measures, we've got 80 measures that are relevant to the parent. Of course, we only measure those measures at various periods during the year. So out of those 80, we didn't measure 53, we only measured 27. I've already talked about the COVID impacts. A couple of other measures that we're just keeping an eye on. First is compliance cases, non-compliance cases for menacing dogs. So if we're dealing with menacing dogs, we hope they can become compliant within 3 months. We've just noticed that performance has declined, so we're achieving a 53% compliance rate against a target of 90%. That reflects, it's COVID related actually, so it reflects our staff not being able to kind of follow up because of the lockdowns, but also the fact that de-sexing for menacing dogs hasn't been available as much as it could be just because of those COVID lockdowns. The other one that we're looking at too is the number of off-licence premises that pass a controlled purchase operation targeting underage drinkers. So this is where we go out and test whether they're complying with that. The metric doesn't look too bad, so we're at a rate of 85% compared to 90% target. However, in the Hibiscus Coast, out of 40 inspections that we did, 4 failed. So we've taken action against all those 4 premises, so I guess that shows that the activity is working. But again, it's just a piece of an area of performance that we'll just keep an eye on. Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to note, and Craig will be talking, I'm guessing, more about this, is just the great results in the regulatory area around statutory compliance with resource and building consents, especially the timeliness. This has been an ongoing issue, and we've seen a steady climb in performance against those, especially those 2 metrics. We're now at 82% of resource consents being processed within the 20-day statutory timeframe. And for building consents, that's 91%, and it continues to improve. So I just think that's it's been a lot of work to bring that into line, and it's great to see that result just keep improving over time. So it's probably a good note to hand over to you, Craig.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you through the chair, and thanks, David. Yes, I remember I reflected that 6 months ago I came and spoke to you and talked about the improvements in regulatory services, and it's always dangerous doing that because if it goes backwards, you can look a bit silly. Fortunately, we continue to improve, and we'll share some information on that now. This isn't relative to the time frame that we're reviewing at the moment, but this is the 12-month data for the last financial year. And it really just gives you an idea of the volume of work that we're doing in regulatory services. It was pretty much a record year. I think the last year we had a year like this was around about 2016, I believe, Ian. Ian McCormick can verify that better than I can, but it was a huge year. And interestingly, for the period under review, the first quarter of this current financial year, we've been up another 11% on Q1 of last year in resource consents. We were up 10% on inspections, 2% on building consents lodged. So really, we're still seeing this fantastic growth and in this really red-hot development market that we anticipated we would lose around about 30% through COVID, but we're not seeing that. Reference has been made to the financial performance. It is something we're quite proud of. I know there is always a bit of hesitation around we talk numbers because are we charging too much? reality is we're actually taking a lot more of a commercial view in regulatory services. Our billing performance is, so basically passing on the costs that people incur, is far better than it has been forever, basically, which we're quite proud of. I think also I'd just make the point that for every day that we reduce the time that we have a consent with us, the quicker we can get that out the door, the greater value we add to Auckland Incorporated. And that's something that we are really very mindful of, just in terms of reducing interest costs and so on to developers and the like. So we're doing a lot of work in that space. I'm going to hand over to Ian for the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit to it as well. But I would just like to flag on behalf of Ian and just the great work that the Building Consents team's been doing. I think you'll all remember the issues 2 or 3 years ago when we had an auditor's report which was pretty damning on our performance in building consents. We've had IANs back in September to do their audit. They were coming annually. They were so impressed with what we've done, or what the building consents team have done in terms of improvements, that I think we had, well, Ian can talk to the number of corrective actions, a very limited number, and I've now got that much confidence in what we're doing in that department that they've taken the audit out 2 years, which is the same as everyone else. So I think that's a real credit to Ian and his team and what they've done. So to talk to the next slide, if I can pass over to Ian.
Thanks, Craig. Continued steady improvement in our statutory performance. Obviously, that's only one side of the equation. It's just one measure. But I think what's really important is that is a very accurate measure for exactly how much time those applications are actually being worked on by our team, to the hour. So a lot of work, as Craig's mentioned, that's gone on over the last couple of years with Audit New Zealand to make sure that is absolutely accurate. And it's really pleasing to see that figure's continued to increase. As Craig mentioned, it's continued to increase even though over the last 5 months we continue to see more building consents being lodged month on month than the previous year. And as Craig mentioned, when we compare, for example, October with, we have to go all the way back to 2016-17, which was our biggest year for consents before we can find something to compare it with. And we're doing that with less staff than we had before as well. As a result of COVID, we haven't been actively filling permanent roles. And I guess we're also doing it with having most of our staff spending anything from 2 to 3 to 4 days working from home. Our productivity, and we can demonstrate it, is better than it's ever been, which is enabling us to be able to manage this turnaround. So I must say it's great to see. You see the building consenting numbers there. What you don't see as well is complexity. So we're continuing to see an increase in the complexity of the building consents we're dealing with as well, particularly in the residential 3 area. So residential 3 is, I guess, those attached houses, terraced housing, that type of thing. Significant increase in that year on year. That also puts, pressure on our team to make sure we've got enough people who are competent to work at that level of complexity, because under our regulations we are required to have staff having a demonstrated competency to work at that level. So again, really, really great results. Inspection delivery, you don't see that there. We're currently delivering more than 10% more inspections than we did last year, consistently over the last 5 months, which is, if you think about it, thinking back to where the world was or where we were in April or May, just incredible. The resilience of the industry, construction industry, is an absolute joy to behold. And let's face it, I mean, it's key for the recovery of the economy. Customer satisfaction, it's also really pleasing to see that going up. I must say I was really concerned looking back at July through to September. I was sort of thinking, if you saw a line like that on a monitor in a hospital, the patient would be dead. There was no movement in it at all, and I couldn't understand, even though we were improving our service levels, it just didn't move. Fortunately, round about sort of October, November, it did start to shift, and we can see a consistent improvement up to 72%, largely due, I think, to closer working with the industry, greater effort of our team picking the phone up and talking to customers when they've got requests for information, and I guess better documentation and I guess interaction between us and the industry. So we're really pleasing to see, Craig.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. It is, and if I just let councillors know that, yeah, we are on this transformation journey in regulatory services. We've labelled it Kokuriti Whakamua, so looking back at the past, learning from that and taking those learnings forward. And the team are doing an outstanding job. We've actually broken our entire work program into a portfolio management approach, and that's being managed to make sure we deliver every project we start. We have the resource available for it. We have the capital to support the systems changes. A lot of what you've seen to date has been around process improvement, more so than systems improvements. They'll follow on the next year or two. This information that we are showing you here will be shared with you. We did a presentation to the Regulatory Committee on Tuesday, and the document that you'll receive will have a whole lot of background information in it as well, and also identify all the functions of each of the different departments within regulatory services. Just quickly running through the next slides, customer satisfaction as it relates to the other areas of our business. Environmental health and alcohol licensing has always been high. It remains high, which is great. We have recently merged those units together in licensing and regulatory compliance, and we're also including the street trading component into that as well. The idea being that we want to create, I guess, a one-stop shop for the hospitality and entertainment sectors. So instead of having to deal with a whole lot of different people at different times and licenses expiring at different times, we're going to line everything up together to make sure that those customers get a much better, streamlined experience. We still do have a bit of a challenge with noise in terms of satisfaction. It is a difficult one. We didn't respond to noise complaints through the COVID lockdown, so again had some fallout in that space. But generally, again, our stats are remaining pretty static, if not improving, so we're really reasonably pleased about that. And just finally, the final slide. I know as elected officials, you're regularly getting it in the neck from developers, from constructors around timeframes. It is a challenge, and we don't take those complaints lightly. We look at every one and try and resolve it. But I did think I'd do a little bit of work around what is the percentage of complaints, because networked individuals sitting on big portfolios tend to be very noisy, and quite often the squeaky wheel does get the oil. We understand that. But reality is complaint rates compared to the volume of consents that we put out are actually very low. The highest complaint rate there is 1% in resource consents, which is a little bit of a dark art. There's a science involved, but it can be a bit grey as well. So I just wanted to share that with you because I think it is important to understand that while our customer satisfaction metrics are looking good, they're improving, could always be better. In terms of complaints, we have a limited number as well. So, Madam Chair, that's really our update.
Thank you very much. There's quite a lot in there, so I will open for questions first. And I have Councillor Stewart, Councillor Casey and Councillor Coombe. Councillor Stewart.
Oh, thank you for that presentation. It's very good. Just on the illegal dumping, I see that seems to be increasing. A concern out there in the community is that with all the infill housing, we're going to see a lot more of that. I have been talking with Parole. I don't know if you need to come up here and talk, but I think it's really important that we get that message out there that any illegal dumping, that people report it to the in the bin at auckland.govt.nz. But one of the things that I think we really need to start thinking about, and I know that Otara and I think Manuira have done in the past, is to have something like the Neat Street again, because we are going to have a lot more of this illegal dumping. People that illegal dump, they're not going to pay anyway. They're going to drive around at night. They're going to illegal dump. So if we had something like Neat Streets that perhaps could be twice a year, you could have one the beginning of the year, one closer to the end of the year, and maybe volunteers. Sorry, you right? Okay. Volunteer groups. Have you lowered my voice down? Or put it up? Okay, sometimes I don't hear it when I'm trying to listen. Okay, so one of the things that I'd like to see is maybe we encourage people to take photos discreetly of people that are illegal dumping and of the vehicles and of the persons, and then to get that through to us, and if they could do it to the in the bin, I'm sure we can go through that, because I'm constantly getting people ringing me up with illegal dumping. Yeah, so that's really, I think there is an increase in illegal dumping, and I think the more and more infill housing we have, the more we're going to have that. And I know we've got the inorganic once a year, people can ring up and they can book, but I think sometimes people, most people will take it to the dump, but there's going to be a lot of people that are just going to legal dump, and we have to find some solutions. Thank you.
I suppose the question around that, Parul, might be, when is the next promotion of how you register illegal dumping, bearing in mind we have Christmas and a lot of stuff that people might want to get rid of. So when's the next promotion of that?
Kia ora tātou. Thank you for that, Madam Chair. It is an ongoing process and an ongoing awareness campaign that we do raise, and we take every opportunity to, when we do have a prosecution, to put a story out there. So you would have seen about a week ago we had one around green waste, and in terms of making sure people are aware there are consequences of when people do illegally dump. And a lot of that is mainly targeted around commercial operators who pick up your waste and then dispose it off in an illegal manner. We will be looking at doing some more stories around Christmas. We know that period is coming, and putting a bit of an information out there to say, firstly, from a residential perspective, make sure if you do engage with the supplier who's saying it's really cheap to take it away, there's something wrong. So just make sure you're aware. And as I've discussed with Councillor Stewart as well, people, if we are investigating, then the person's got evidence in it, will get into trouble. So I think just putting information out there, making sure people are aware where can they take their product, and raising awareness of the fact that the illegal dumping has consequences is quite critical. The other side of it is the team does work really closely and efficiently in terms of picking up illegally dumped rubbish as well, where it's reported in. Hence, we are seeing an increase in numbers coming through for reporting as well. And we're trying to make it as easy as possible through a phone number, and where we've got issues with long waiting times, there is an email address as well. So it is definitely an ongoing issue, and thanks to the mayoral campaign, we do have extra resources in there to make sure that we are enforcing as well.
Thank you for that. Councillor Casey, your question.
Kind of a question, kind of a comment. Thank you so much. This is the second time I've heard this part of in a week that's black, this has been a joy, both the first time and the second time. It really is. And what I want to do, and I said that in the regulatory committee as well, is to milk this for all it's worth. These are really good news stories. And in little bits, we can feed them out over the next while. The bit in the report that said, media sentiment continued its positive trajectory. Media sentiment. Sentiment is not something I ever associate with the media, but I understand what it means. It's not just that, it's the feeling, like the feeling of the public towards the council is different now to what it was before COVID. And I think that will be reflected in the trust figures, which I don't think have ever been over 35 for as long as I've been a councillor. So I don't know when that comes out, but the customer satisfaction is really important, because we did do a good job, and it is being reflected in these figures. And I just want you to take a lesson from the library about how to deliver good news. We did the 10 millionth ebook about a week ago. Alfie's not here. It was fantastic. It just so happened that the young woman who took out the 10 millionth ebook was a Mexican in Auckland for 3 years. Her name was Sarid Oliveira Anzures. She was almost like we had paid her to do the job. It was a fantastic for the libraries, fantastic media coverage, hopefully into the future.
But that if we celebrate the little things and you know, we could do something on every page up there, we will counter some of the unsentiment that we get from the media on a day-to-day basis. Thank you so much. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Councillor. It's always nice to celebrate good news, isn't it? Councillor Coombe.
Tēnā koe, Madam Chair, morena koutou. Thank you for the report, and it's great to hear Councillor Casey really kicking off with some of those positives in there. I had a query that's drilling down a bit more in terms of the FTEs, and I just would like to know, how do we report and track kind of the negative downside of FTE cuts, where, for example, I see that the ports have had a decline in FTEs, and now we're hearing that that's had a big impact on their productivity and having all these domino effects of an impact on our economy. But there's no way of kind of drilling into that in terms of the report. So I know this is something that is sort of work in progress, but that would seem to be a really big concern if we're not on top of what the unintended consequences are of FTE cuts.
David, Nicola? Oh, no. Craig? No?
It's probably not one for Craig. I don't.
Right.
I can certainly speak from regulatory, Madam Chair.
All right. That's your department, so yes, that would be a good one to start with.
It certainly is a balancing act, Councillor, there's no doubt about that. We have reduced our spend on consultants significantly as well, trying to use FTEs as best we can, and we don't manage our own demand, so it is a balancing act. Certainly the CE and the exec leadership team are on a weekly basis reviewing FTEs and who we bring in and for why. So we're not, I guess, cutting off our nose to spite our face, but it is a challenge, no doubt about that.
Thank you. I mean, I guess I was really keen, it's not really, Craig, in your area, for a response around the port issue, because that one is just, we haven't been briefed on it yet, but it seems to have hit us in the face that actually something is happening there with productivity and staff cuts, and we need to be across it. So I'm just keen to know how that's going to be captured and reported in terms of that side of FTE cuts.
Kevin, do you want to deal with that? I know the Mayor has sent us a memo on ports recently, but Kevin, do you want to update?
Yeah, there was a report. It didn't go into the detail around the FTEs. What we can just ask if the 18, it may well just be attrition at the time. It may be a timing aspect to it, so we can get some more detail on that 18 reduction and just work out what it means as far as workload goes, risk. Is it a permanent reduction? Is it actually a temporary one due to attrition at the time? We'll get some more detail on that.
Thank you, that would be good. And is it something that we can look to have reported next quarter in terms of a note?
Yep.
Of cuts?
We can note that we will, and I know that there was media coverage the ports are actually short of staff at the moment. Yeah.
Hence the reduction.
Oh, sorry, okay, yes, Deputy
So
Mayor?
the Ports of Auckland Limited is coming to the CCTO Oversight Committee on the 8th of December. So a chance to bore into that then.
Okay, so I won't add a recommendation then. Are you happy with that, Councillor, if we leave it till that time? Okay, thanks. Yeah, thank you. We'll give them a heads up in advance. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And there is going to be an article going out about illegal dumping, and I think Councillor Stewart has been asked to quote in there. So that's going to be reminding people about, what to do with our rubbish, and a whole lot of tips around basically putting them back into the circular economy rather than on the side of the road. So that's good. The other thing, this presentation came to the regulatory committee, so some people have seen it again, but we're going to send it out to everybody because there's some really neat numbers there. And one of the ones I'm just astounded by is 3,500 building inspections a week. 3.5. So imagine how busy our staff are and how, when we're doing that, that means that building can keep going and that things are being built well. And so when I hear people going, oh, this is useless and that's useless, I just think of that number of how many people we've got out there racing around doing that work and all the rest of the regulatory work. So, Yeah, and the other thing I just wanted to comment on was that Libby app for the libraries was a lifesaver for me during lockdown, as well as all sitting we did in meetings, to just be able to go online, you have your library card, and I could borrow any book I wanted, you know, if I didn't have to wait for 6 weeks. But that is a really extraordinary service for library card holders. So, yeah, I think we've got some good results here. I'm really pleased that we've been able to keep going, even though we've had all these COVID restrictions and all these tumultuous changes with staffing and things like that. I think we should be really proud of our staff. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we go into comments, I'm still on questions theoretically, but that's all right, that's all right. I'm going to just ask a question because one of the things I put in my chair's recommendations that I picked up as a highlight was the council award that we got as from Algam. So David or Nicola, do you want to talk to what that was? And it's wonderful that we got it for our response to COVID-19. So who would like to talk to us about that? David?
Yeah, I'm afraid, Councillor, I don't know too many details about that, but we can send a note around of outlining the specifics of that award. But I think you're right, it does reflect the amazing response that we had across the whole of the group to COVID-19.
Probably should have given you a heads up. But if you write good news in the report, expect me to pick it up, okay?
Yeah,
Just
sure.
note to self.
Noted, Councillor.
Yes. Okay. Any more questions before I go to comments officially? Councillor Walker.
Sure. Just a comment around the drop in full-time equivalents, which is essentially people losing their jobs. Do we actually follow through with what's happening to those people in some way, shape or form? And I guess the reason I ask that is that we're effectively the, I wouldn't say monopoly, but close to that within the Auckland region. Quite obviously, we've got other councils around New Zealand that have also got problems. I think many of our people are often quite specialised in the areas that they may be working in, may be suffering. So I think we do have some form of obligation to at least have some kind of follow-through. And then further to that, do we actually maintain perhaps some communication? Because if we have a pickup at some point in time, many of these people are the ideal people to actually recruit back because we don't have to train them, they're already up to speed. So just a general question, I don't know whether human resources apply that, but I would suggest our circumstance as an employer is quite unique in New Zealand.
I'll ask Kevin to start the answer on that. Thank you.
Right. Yep, thank you, Chair. Thanks for the sentiment, and obviously we have that ourselves as well. We do look after our staff. So there's a few aspects to that. The first up is David did mention there was a lot was actually occurring, so it was promoted through attrition, so there are people still with voluntary turnover as well. We go through a process. First up is if there are roles no longer deemed to be needed, we have a very intensive redeployment program within council, and that extends across the group. We look for opportunities. So if the existing role is not needed due to circumstances, we will look at whether that person has an opportunity to explore another role across the council. If it does end up with the person leaving, there is an outsourced program where we can help people with CVs, interview skills and other aspects. And obviously exit interviews and things to try and ascertain, what is the circumstances leading to that person leaving? Was it the role or the person? So we did hear mentioned earlier on, 70% of our internal vacancies have actually been through internal recruitment. So that is suggesting people are moving and taking career opportunities within council. The other aspect is the monopoly aspect. Yeah, there are some services, functional areas we have which are quite unique to council. There are also others which are competing on the open market. Much wider skill sets that you'd apply, ICT, engineering and others, which are actually a marketable commodity across there. So we don't really think that people leaving us may be for very positive reasons. They've actually grown in council and taken that next opportunity in their career.
I understand that. I guess my question was whether we actually have any ongoing communication, whether we follow any people up just to see how they're getting on. And and around possible recruitment later.
We wouldn't intrude on the individual. If the person wants to stay in touch, so obviously there's personal contacts, but we also have a job site where if a person wants to keep notifications, say, hey, I'm interested in coming back, they've got every opportunity, they'll get email notifications telling them when certain roles are coming up. It will just depend on individual circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? Yes, Councillor Watson, you had a question.
Yeah, in terms of the reporting for the asset recycling program that's referred to in point 11, which mentions 4 properties that have gone unconditional, and I'm not sure if this is the item or not, but in terms of reporting, we're bound by a set of principles that go to the disposal of these properties, particularly in terms of the price achieved can't be less than 90% of the valuation without the approval of the Finance Performance Committee. So what is the process, the reporting process for itemising the actual valuation and the subsequent sale price? Just to follow through on that oversight that's clearly identified in those principles that we have agreed to.
Thank you, Councillor. And Ross, that's definitely your question.
Yeah, through the chair. Thanks for the question. I can either answer that now or pick it up in the next item where there's actually an update on asset recycling in more detail. Just however. Okay, thank you.
To wait? Okay, thank you, John. No further comments. Your Worship, questions. Your Worship, you had a comment.
Yeah, look, a comment. These are hard times, and I want to pick up Kathy Casey's point to say there's some really good news in this, and I thought that Craig and Ian were going to go, which was a pity because I was going to say something complimentary. Not always the case, Craig, when we have discussions about these things. But at a time when we are doing record processing of building consents, 15,470, record month last month, highest ever on record, for you to lift our approvals from, 58 to 72% is spectacularly good, and also to lift the satisfaction, 77 to 92%, on your within the 20 days, and 58 to 72 on building satisfaction. And I can see the Herald headline tomorrow: spectacular improvement in performance by council. Not. Thank you for the comment that there were more positive comments coming out of the media, but I'm used to seeing comments that say disaster, etc., totally unfounded, rather than an acknowledgement. But I want to make this public acknowledgement to particularly your team, Ian. Fantastic. Really good job. It was a worry to us what was happening, and you've lifted your game, and you're doing really well under pressing circumstances. To Parole, also, it's really good news when you get an increase in reporting, but a decrease in volume in illegal dumping. And the fact that we've raised the profile of that, I think, has made a difference. Certainly has in Bill and my area. I used to just go mad driving home at night and seeing yet another illegal tipping. I thought that would go up after the lockdown. Fortunately, it hasn't. So congratulations to your team. It's a sign of the times. We used to get a headline when we prosecuted somebody because it was so rare. Now I put the press statement out and nobody picks it up. But that's, I just wanted, Madam Chair, to acknowledge both of those things. And, that is, what I want to say to the team is that you can come back if you keep delivering news like that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Look, it's good for me to follow actually as a comment then around this, because I've done some Chair's recommendation that note the financials, which is always very good to me. I like that. The 575 million of capital expenditure for the group, 23 million more than last year, even though, of course, this is the emergency budget. So even though we were 450 behind, we are still actually getting out there and delivering in the capital space, and also our net debt operating result. So Revenue's up 36 million and our expenditure's down 35, which is really good financially in both cases. So in moving, I wanted to highlight that. I also wanted to highlight the fact that we had an award. I think that's really good. It notes there's another organisation that has acknowledged the work we have done in response to COVID-19. And then I just quickly added a note, which I shouldn't have quickly, I should have picked it up already, noted the substantial performance improvements in the regulatory area. So I would like to move those. Do I have a seconder? Linda, I think, I think Linda, do you have a comment?
I wanted to congratulate the staff on the COVID response rather than just noting the award.
I'm very happy to do that,
Just
Councillor,
massage
yes.
it a little bit.
Just give me a
So
second.
the committee's congratulating the staff on the award
Note.
rather than just noting.
Note the committee. Okay. Hold the line, caller. It makes part of D. Excellent. Make ED. Perfect. Can you all see that? Let's scroll up a little bit. All good? Okay, we have a mover and a seconder. On the receipt, on receiving. Yeah, on receiving the All of Council award from the, yeah. Congratulations staff on receiving the All of Council award from the, that's right, from the take out of receiving the All of Council, it's supposed to be the All of Council Supportive Team Award.
I think maybe just put the All of Council back where it was.
Yep. Recognising, okay. Good things take time. Excellent. Okay, we've got a mover and a seconder.
And we've also got comments, I think, from Councillor.
Right, I've got two more comments. Is that correct? Did you want to make a comment, Councillor Dalton?
I really just wanted to make a comment around the CCOs and their response too.
Absolutely.
I think particularly during the level 3 lockdown in Auckland Transport in particular, who continue to respond quite efficiently in terms of health and safety. But I think acknowledging the staff that have lost their jobs as part of the emergency budget that have contributed to the savings, you know, that's I think that's important that we do that. And just in terms of joining the Mayor's Fan Club around regulatory, I think that was a presentation we had at Value for Money much earlier in the year. And just congratulations to them as well for the change in the processes. It was really, really impressive. And just on illegal dumping parole, I'd like to acknowledge your team and the way that they respond so well to local boards who lead, and that they will they acknowledge the leverage of money and efficiency, and we have seen illegal dumping drop and been able to broker the relationships with Kāinga Ora and others. So congratulations, Parole. Thank you for that. Thank you for your support. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you for that acknowledgement. No further comments? Well, we have a mover and a seconder. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you. And again, congratulations to the staff. Thank you. Now we move on to item 9, which of course is our monthly update on the emergency budget. So although that was the legal requirement around the quarterly reporting, I just reminded you that we have a monthly update just to track us, see how we're tracking against the pretty stringent emergency budget targets we've put together as a result of our revenue loss. So we have Parole, Nicola and Ross. Pramod.
I'll put my dress on. Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Ross, Nicola and I are here to give you the emergency budget update, as we have been doing over the last few months as well. This update will cover the period up to the end of October. The key items covered in this month's update are reflected in the staff recommendations that are up on the screen now. So we've got the usual dashboard update, which gives you high-level indications of how we're performing financially, as well as against some of the key metrics like asset recycling and regional fuel tax and the like. We've also got the update on how we're tracking against the 120 million savings target, which Nicola will update you on, and then finally an update on the asset recycling, which Ross will talk to. In terms of the financial performance for the group to the end of October, it's a similar story to the quarterly update that you just received. The positive trend has continued for another month. Overall performance remains on track. However, one change to the indicators from the previous month is related to the overall revenue for the group, which has now, the indicator is now showing a favourable variance to budget rather than on track. And that's reflective of purely a financial measure. A lot of things still remain uncertain, and a lot of the positive variance there is related to the regulatory revenue, which has continued positively, as well as the Watercare IGC and new connection revenue. Watercare have also advised that they remain on track in achieving their 120 million target to contribute towards the debt headroom. A lot of that is reflected in the positive revenue result to date. Capital expenditure remains below budget, and again, the indications at this stage that forecast-wise we will achieve the agreed budget, and a lot of the variance to date is related to timing. Asset recycling target remains a risk, as it has over the last few months, but Ross will talk to that in more detail shortly. And we continue to actively monitor our risks and issues in financial performance monthly.
So I'm pleased to be able to report that we've achieved 87 million of savings towards our $120 million target. That's 72.5%, and 9 million of that we achieved in the month of October. The largest contributor to the savings was 5 million of additional interest costs, and that's being able to take advantage of the current lower interest rates. The other thing, in the last item, we talked about the Q1 results and that the expenditure was favourable. We have looked through all of the areas of underspend across the organisation and identified those that can contribute towards additional one-off savings for the year, and that has contributed another 1.86 million towards the savings target. I wasn't going to go into the other areas, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them afterwards, and I will hand over to Ross.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as Pramod mentioned, the asset recycling is at risk, and I believe it will remain at risk right the way through this financial year. Just because it's at risk and we have a high degree of uncertainty doesn't mean we're not doing anything about it. The opportunities that we've presented, I'm quite comfortable will be achieved. It's just the time frame that they will be achieved within. The runway, or the length of time that we have between now and the end of the financial year, puts us under pressure, particularly when we're about to lose, 6 to 8 weeks over that December-January period. And it's that tension that we need to balance between actually achieving the outcomes we want, maximising value for money, and meeting the budget target. There's various trade-offs that have to be considered as we work through. We do continue to use the principles, and at the end I'll touch on Councillor Watson's question in a bit more detail. I have been working on a 4-year plan for asset recycling. In the long-term plan workshops, we've talked about at a high level what that could look like, and yesterday I was actually planned to discuss that with you, but that will happen later today in a workshop, talk about actually what does the next 4 years could look like. over the next couple of weeks, I will be bringing to you 2 new opportunities, for your consideration that haven't previously been canvassed, but to actually see if these are areas you would like us to look at. But we are pushing hard, but we're pushing hard to make sure we do the right thing. So I just look at the 2 key areas to start with. Around property, we've got 33 million of unconditional sales to date, and we've got a strong pipeline of opportunity. So the volume of properties that have been approved by the committee gives us a strong pipeline for us now to operationalise. And the top 10 properties in that pipeline are worth just over around $110 million. So focusing on those top 10, which give you some more detail in the committee report, is actually how we'll make sure that we actually achieve a big portion of that budget. In respect of the car park, a lot of work has been undertaken around that car park concession. Auckland Transport have engaged PwC to help them develop a business case. We had hoped to come and talk to the committee prior to Christmas, but that business case won't be considered by the Auckland Transport Board until February, and then we will come and talk to you about that. There's nothing at this stage that makes us think actually we can't do something. There's been some market sounding, there is market interest in the type of transaction, but we also have to be cautious that we structure that transaction correctly. Because of the accounting rules, a straight sale and leaseback arrangement becomes another form of debt, doesn't help our debt to revenue ratios. So we want to be able to structure that in the right way that we actually achieve multiple outcomes that we're seeking from our car parks. In terms of this picture's a wee bit just to try and give you a sort of feel for actually, where we're sitting with property. So we've got a $244 million budget this year. We've achieved 33. I've got $191 million of opportunity. Of that, 110 is focused in 10 properties. And those will be realised over the course of this financial year, but some will actually take until 22-23 probably to realise. And these are such properties that have reserve status currently, and we have to go through the reserve revocation process. The Reserves Act gives us a very structured process to follow, and actually that just takes time for us to work through. I've also got some new opportunities that we've identified, and early in the new year we'll come back and talk to you about those new opportunities. In commercial, you'll recall the last committee meeting in the confidential section, you approved a prepaid lease arrangement. That's now being worked through to actually put that in place. And the car park concession, as we discussed. Now, just to pick up on Councillor Watson's question, and it's good just to give me a couple of bits of time because I can now give a fuller answer to that with just some elements. So the principles are continuing to be used, and there's sort of six different principles. I suppose a couple of the balancing act is that value for money. So to ensure the value for money from the property portfolio, Panuku Board at their meeting at the beginning of October, considered the go-to-market strategy for all the properties that have been approved. That go-to-market strategy takes into account a number of factors, including whether we need to do master planning on the site, whether it could be mixed use, whether the Crown may be interested, is it likely to be residential or commercial? Actually, so what are the outcomes that actually beyond just a financial outcome we might want to achieve? That fits into our alternative use principle. And actually from that, actually assessing each property against the outcomes, then actually what is the right go-to-market strategy? Is that going direct to speak to the Crown? Is that actually an open market process? Is that actually, well, it actually makes sense that actually it can only be sold to an adjoining owner? Panuku's board have adopted the principles that the committee endorsed, in particular the principle around value for money and actually the valuation requirements that are needed. And just to go back to them, an open market process will have one valuation, and a closed market process will have where we actually can only sell to one party or one obvious party will have two valuations, and across that no less than 90% of the valuation basis. So I say that go-to-market strategy has gone to Panuku's board, and they are will monitor progress against that to make sure that those items are being achieved. But obviously I'm happy to take further questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I just all open to Councillor Watson first. Are you confident your question's been answered?
In part, but I guess I would like to see, as I'm sure other councillors would, that for any of the land that's disposed, what the valuation is, because we don't always get that, what the evaluation that's been arrived at and what the subsequent sale is, because otherwise we're not in a position to exercise the oversight that's identified in the principles that go to due process and transparency.
Well, we'll get that for you, Councillor. We'll get that report back. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Walker.
Sure. So I'll just follow on from Councillor Watson. So we've got the principles that we've developed. In addition to that, we've also got the findings of the CCO review, and in particular the concern that they raised around the, quote, right balance between commercial and public benefits, close quote. So I'm making the assumption that we are picking up on that, and especially in areas where public benefits have been identified and they're considerable. I mean, these could be in unlock areas, for example. Are we making sure that we are looking at all the options around retaining those public benefits?
Through the chair, as I mentioned, the go-to-market strategy does consider various components, including what the future use could be. Is it residential, commercial? Is the Crown interested? What is the best approach to actually maximise that and development outcomes? There is a healthy tension between myself and Panuku in terms of actually realising this budget and them actually holding to the development outcomes, which we've asked them to deliver for the city.
Just a complementary question on my part. So in a circumstance where the council has an unlock program, and that program may have identified public benefits, I mean, they could include a square, various recreational activities and the like. Do we still hold true to that unlock process in terms of sales?
Through the chair, that question is probably better passed to Panuku when they come to the CCO Oversight Committee. I'm not looking at the unlock programme, I'm looking at our surplus assets and how we best dispose of them.
Thank you. We'll pick that up in the Deputy Mayor and Councillor Dalton's committee. Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Chair. Just bring up the right page here. So when we make this assumption of the 244 million being positive to budget, that's an assumption, isn't it? That we're aiming to have to be positive to our budget by 244 million through the disposal program, right?
Through the chair, that's correct. The budget includes $244 million of cash to be received by 30th of June, to reduce the requirement for us to borrow $244 million more.
Right, from our asset recycling program. So what do we need to sell? What quantum do we need to dispose of to net 244 million?
Is it possible to go back to the last slide, please, Sandra? So if I just talk a little bit about that slide to answer the councillor's question. So what is whether it's a price or a volume answer to the question. In terms of price, we know what the dollar number is. In terms of volume, so across that $191 million of properties that have been approved, as I said, the top 10 makes up around $110 million, potentially a little bit upside. The balance is there is a lot of properties in a valuation between $1 and $2 million. So actually you've got about 40 or 50 properties that make up the balance of that approved portfolio. So there's a lot to answer your question. You know, so there's a lot of individual transactions have to be worked their way through. There are very few, other than the top 10, there are very few large opportunities, although we will be bringing a new large opportunity to your committee in Councillor Darby next week.
Yeah, and then it goes to finance. So I know that. I guess what I'm getting at is I'm just trying to unpack this for my own benefit. So to reach 224 positive to budget, you need to have your eyes on something a lot larger than that, because there are costs that you will lose before they hit budget. So I'm just, I guess is the answer that we'd be likely looking at more like 280 million or even more to arrive at a 244 net?
Yeah, through the chair, if we recall back to the emergency budget when we actually were going through the different options and the levers, that was the very concept that I raised at the time. You probably need about 25% greater than your budget of opportunities in play, because of various reasons that they may not be realised for whatever reason, or they get slowed down, or there's actually a way to maximise value which slows it down. So you do need more, and that's why, you know, trying to build that pipeline as big as possible and saying actually over multiple years, very comfortable, but you know, by 30th of June, a bit concerned. By 30th of September, yes. But we just got to work out what that impact on cash is as we come back to the council with the impact of all the levers.
Okay, just a quick sort of comment where I'm going, and I'm building on the concern of Councillor Watson, is just that transparency. So there are costs involved in the disposal of property, and in some they might be pretty light in cost, no brokers involved, you know, valuation of course, and then others will be, they'll have more costs, more complicated, you know, planning, master planning required, etc. So one thing that I've just become aware of, Chair, is that this was a contentious issue at the time, the sale of so-called QE Square for 27.2 million, only 25.6 million went into the public spaces. Now, I would be surprised if I went around this table and heard from everybody who thought that nothing less than the 27.2 was going into public spaces. But I've been delving into the downtown issues recently and discovered that 25.6 million went into them, and 1.4 million was in costs. Now, I don't think this committee's ever seen the costs. So I think going forward, we need to see the valuations and the costs so that we're over the top of it. And on that note, Chair, I would like Finance to outline what the costs of 1.4 million were on the downtown disposal to precinct.
Okay, yeah.
At some future time.
Yep, we will do that. I think it's a combined report on both, and we will get that to you probably at 6 months. Seeing we've hit the quarter, we'll you aim to do it in 6 months.
You.
Question from Councillor Casey.
In the dashboard, it says that Ports of Auckland is on track for each of the measures. Given the recent headlines, I find that quite hard to believe, and I wonder if you can comment as to where the dashboard stops in terms of the timing of it. It wouldn't go right up to this week. When was it close off for that?
The reporting period is to the end of October.
It's 1 month report.
Right. I'm just looking at the headlines that say that up to 8 cargo ships had bypassed the port and that they're 50 staff short. So I think my question, if I can couch it like this, is are we expecting it to be favourable? Is that when you give us a dashboard, are we expecting everything to be green? And should we be concerned about on track?
Through the chair, so you shouldn't be concerned about on track. The indicators are very much year to date, so there is no forecast built into that indicator because a lot of things still remain uncertain. In terms of all of the results, it is comparing the year-to-date result to the phasing of the emergency budget, so the Ports of Auckland and other parts of the group that were had revenue hits as a result of COVID. those reductions have already been built into the budget. So when Ports of Auckland report that they're on track, it takes into account significant revenue hits as a result of COVID already. So it's...
If you just remember, Councillor, normally we wouldn't have this report. We would just have nothing until the next quarter. And what we're doing here is giving a higher level of oversight month by month. So there will be some anomalies, I would think. But it's a flag, and we will get reported on that. Anything that's flagged, the staff are, aware of and are keeping a watchful eye on. But I think it's just remember that it is just 1 month as opposed to the normal quarter report. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Just on the asset sales, I see here that we have asset sales target is at risk, and that would probably be, I would imagine, some of our parks and reserves that need to be revoked. Would that be correct?
Through the Chair, as mentioned earlier, the reserve revocation process will take time. So for those that have reserve status, realisation is more likely to be in financial year 21-22.
And with the reserves, for them to be revoked, that then goes out to the public for public consultation. So if you're aware that Councillor Young and I and the local board in our community, there's a number of reserves that we're not comfortable with being sold, and a lot of the communities. So if the community, when they have the opportunity to submit, which that's what they're allowed to do, if it's very, very clear that the councillors, the local board and a lot of the community decide that they don't want these reserves to be sold, who decides after the submissions, and if it's very, very clear that the community and the councillors and the local board, these particular ones they don't want sold, what happens there?
Through the Chair, depending on the feedback that you receive from the consultation, it can go as far as commissioners having to be appointed, independent commissioners to actually hear that, and then that would be reported back. I suppose back to Councillor Darby's question, and that's part of why I'm saying, you need to have, a pipeline greater than, because, there will be some items that have reserve status and the reserve revocation may not occur, but we've still got to work through that process.
Okay, I just want to I've put some Chair's recommendations up, and I just want to draw your attention to B, because I like to share some good news. We don't get it very often, but we're actually at a record ever for Auckland Council savings. The highest ever savings target we've ever achieved is 80 million, and that was done in the first, was it 2011-12 or 10-11, or the very first 10-11, very first year when we amalgamated. And so we've now hit an all-time record. Obviously, it's not going to be the big record that we will actually achieve, because I've given my commitment, Kevin's given it back, that we will actually achieve 120 million. Haven't we, Nicola? Yes. She said, nodding wildly, enthusiastically. But it's just really, it's nice. I mean, some of them are one-off, but it's the biggest savings achievement this council has ever achieved, and it's only been in 4 months. Noting that we're already 1.8 billion in cumulative savings already. Okay, Councillor Cooper.
Just a question on your comment. So is that partly attributed to the number of jobs we've shed?
It's attributed to a number of things, as you can see in the little thermometer.
Yeah, but is that, because we can't keep doing that. That's not really sustainable.
No, and that's part of the eldest. So if you just take savings, remember that there have been savings targets every year. Some of them have been cumulative. Some of them we have kept saving, and that's the 1.8 billion. So 1.8 billion, we made a savings 1 year, and we actually kept that going. Some of them have been one-off, and we haven't been able to keep all the things going, but some we have. $1.8 billion since 2010. That's a 10-year achievement in my book. So where we are with this is, yes, it's a bit of one-offs, The key will be what of the 120 or the 220 that we will take across the group, will we continue on in the LTP? And we know that figure in our heads, we've just, hopefully will.
Is it still that balance between how much do you do that? It might be great to achieve it, but what are on the other side of the ledger, the effects on levels of service or other things that we can or cannot do?
Correct. And I think at the moment we've made the commitment around the emergency budget to make that savings target, noting that it won't have an effect on, I was going to say core council, but that's not a definition, but on frontline services.
Looking at the core council business, aren't we?
Frontline services, yeah. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have some sympathy with the issues that were raised by Councillor Darby. And my question is to Ross with regard to the recommendations that the Chair has just put up there. For anyone reading the minutes, it would imply that the target is the target. So if it's to have the context that we want it to have, how should that be better expressed in order that there could be an understanding that there probably needs to be higher council's objectives on that? So if we're going to get into detail, I mean, either we just sort of have a general, under the recommendation, sort of a general comment there, but if it is to have, for those who are interested, and I think people are following the budgets more closely perhaps than they might have, what would your recommendations be, Ross?
Yeah, thank you. So through the chair, if I preface that with part of what Pramod answered to a question earlier around the dashboard, and if you look at the dashboard you're getting monthly, asset recycling is the only bit showing in red. And what we're trying to do with the dashboard is actually, it's quite right that you should be asking lots of questions and giving a lot of interest, because actually at that point in time, there is risk to it. And what we don't want to do, and I don't want to do, is suddenly come to you early next year or middle of next year and say, actually, I'm not going to get there, and actually come as a surprise. So just trying to be very transparent and upfront. What's in to the specific resolution, it is factually correct. I'll look at it and go, yep, okay, got a long way to go. I suppose the contextualising, Councillor Fletcher, is that the 33 is after 4 months and the 244 is after 12. So I would never have expected the 244 to have been realised after 4 months. Yeah.
And that's the purpose of a monthly update, you know, it's where you are as of this particular time. Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Ross. I mean, we've had a couple of conversations about this, but what Councillor Darby has identified is the requirement for a bigger pipeline of asset sales in order to hit a target. Now, there will come a point where there'll be a limit to what we can sell, and I sense that we're either going to reach an end soon, or the balance of things left to sell are going to become harder, circa what Councillor Stewart has identified in relation to revocation reserves, which will be very controversial in certain communities. At the same time, this also foreshadows the end to the Panuku model in terms of what it can sell in order to recycle capital for redevelopment, reinvestment. So at what point do we have to make a decision as to the funding model for Panuku based on this type of model? Because you'll be aware that there's a limit to what we can sell in terms of hitting a budget target. The same principle applies in relation to transform and unlock and a capital recycling program for Panuku. When do we take that decision?
So through the chair, if I can just split the answer into two for a second and talk about Panuku second. You know, selling assets is not a sustainable funding source. You know, so actually you can't keep on doing that forever. In the answer to Councillor Darby's question, you know, there's very few big opportunities left, although when I talk to you around the long-term plan, I will highlight a couple of bigger opportunities that you may wish to consider. So it comes a lot of little transactions. The current long-term plan has an underlying $20 million per annum from selling of non-service property. So properties that actually, don't meet our service needs or have been left over from capital works. So there is an underlying ongoing budget that can be probably achieved over, almost into perpetuity, because you always do capital works and you always have things left over. But it gets harder and harder. In respect of Panuku, we did do a workshop, and obviously we've discussed subsequent to that where, the Panuku funding model. The CCO review said, actually, you need to look at the Panuku funding model. We did some work looking at funding model, and again, it is not a sustainable funding model. It does fund Panuku for the next 6 to 7 years if they have the same work programme, and at that point it was, well, actually, you don't have to do anything to change the funding model of this long-term plan if you don't want to. It's not a must-do, whereas there's many other things that are probably a must-do, assuming you want that activity that Panuku continues to do to continue over the next 6 to 7 years.
But as you know, the longitudinal nature of property development means that you have to give certainty that you're either going to do it beyond that or you're not. And if you're not, or if you are or not, you need to make a decision in advance that you can't just do it at year 5, year 6 or year 7. You have to do it in the years subsequent to that. Are we going to be having a debate and ending that in this round, or are we going to be doing it next year, or are we going to do it in 3 years?
Through the chair, understood that between now and, the chair's talked about annual long-term plans, but actually between now and the next 3-year period, if you get to 3 years' time, it is a must-do situation, I would suggest, given what you're saying, actually, but that would still give you 3 to 4 years of runway to actually put an alternative in, should you choose.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker?
Just got a question around costs and the like associated with COVID. So have we looked at what our cost savings were during COVID and since, due to the larger number of staff that have been working from home and flexible hours and so on, lower electricity charges and operational charges?
Thank you for your question, Councillor, through the chair. We are identifying areas of underspend in the budget, so we have seen some of the building utilities costs, for example, drop. So there has been some of that, yeah.
And I'm making the assumption that a number of these things are kind of, I wouldn't say locked in, but we've got a bit of a new normal now, haven't we, in terms of the number of people that are operating flexibly from home and elsewhere. And I'm just curious as to what the cost savings are around that, and obviously there'll be savings in carbon emissions, I'd assume.
I'm not aware of the specific cost savings, but the corporate property team have been responding to the changing way in which we're working and understanding the proportion of time spent working from home, etc. We're in the process. I think it's a bit of a live thing going through and adjusting then how we use our space, how many people are on a floor and so forth, but that's kind of in process, so we should be able to update on that in due course.
Add to that if I can.
Yeah.
If I just add here through the chair, we've sort of given ourselves that 6-month grace period just to find out what the new normal is. And we are looking at accommodation footprint, we are looking at our vehicle fleet, there's lots of things we're actually making savings on, but we've really given ourselves that 6-month time frame to sort of assess just what the new normal might look for the group, not just council. And so we can come back then and sort of start to try and quantify some of those costs. Yeah, we do know utility costs have dropped quite a lot, but that's also because some of the initiatives that were underway at the time. We're putting in some smart metering, we're actually doing some options around our utility use, both gas and electricity. So the ongoing program as well as COVID, it's hard to sometimes separate that, but the notion is if we get to this first 6 months, and then we can sort of come back and give you an indication as to what those new cost structures might look like, which can then help feed into our long-term plan as well.
Just one other question, Madam Chair, and I mean, technically it's not maybe associated with our internal financial performance, but there's no question that a significant part of the CBD is really suffering for a whole variety of reasons, but many of them associated with council-related projects. Is that something that we've got a particular team set up around, and are we, collecting metrics around that?
It's quarterly in the city centre is up in the capital project team. That was in the last item, an update of that was in the last item.
What the chair's referring to is as our work programme in the city centre, but I think what the councillor's asking about is actually the impact on the communities and the business. Yep, look, again, it's always hard to quantify what's been driven by what. CBD definitely has had an economic impact as far as less people come into the city, utilising the services, be it lunches or other things. What we do know, though, is also out in the suburban areas, we're getting a bit of a pickup happening in those areas too. So pretty hard to quantify. I'm not quite sure. We can see if the Economist has got access to any of that information. I'm sure there'll be some around. Heart of the City have done some work themselves.
Thank you. Councillor Stewart.
Oh, thank you for that. Just a question, just on the $33 million of assets that have been achieved. I guess they're now unconditional. Would that be correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, and just making sure that of those that are now been achieved, have I'm just thinking of one in particular that was in my community that had been vacant since 1995. I just want to make sure that there is, with some of these that we're trying to sell, that we have timelines, that they're not going to be land banked and sitting for another 20 or 30 years. So that would mean 40 years of my life I would have seen an empty building. So thank you.
Through the chair, the property I think the councillor is referring to will be 16 Fencible Drive. That certainly was in the Panuku board report outlining, what a good go-to-market strategy was and how greater outcomes than just pure financial could be achieved for the community.
Thank you. The only reason I concerned on that one is because Manukau, we sold it in the early 2000s, and then we ended up having to buy it back because it was empty, and then of course it's been empty all just about the whole time. It's 1995. Thank you.
Efeso, can you hear me? No. I suggest, Councillor Stewart, you talk to Efeso, Councillor Collins, because he's our liaison councillor too for Panuku. Okay. Councillor Cooper.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm just wondering about this discussion because this is a public meeting and we're basically almost making our stuff to buy. Nobody would want to because of all the issues, that are being highlighted here. We've made a decision to sell this stuff. Things will go through their reserve revocation, but I'm concerned about kind of relitigating different bits of land here, but also, skewing the market. We shoot ourselves in the foot. So I just ask you, Madam Chair, if these sorts of discussions are going to happen, that we have a little bit of discretion. We will never meet our targets. No one will want to come near us.
Good point.
That's what's trying to happen here.
Good point. And this is actually a 1-month progress update against our emergency budget. The resolutions are in front of you. It notes that this is the October 8 update. In positive, it talks about in 4 months now we've actually achieved a record amount of sales. The not so positive is there are only 33 million out of our target on asset sales, and that's it.
I'm not disputing any of the work that's been done. It's been done as fast as it can be in a difficult market. However, I don't like the fact that we could actually be discouraging people by some of our comments. That's just...
I think your point's been made. Thank you. Any other comments? Well, I'll move the recommendations. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Dalton. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you.
Aye.
Oh. Hi, Efeso. Item 10 now is our submission to MB, consultation on the government procurement rules. And we have Jazz Singh here, our General Manager of Procurement. We haven't got Councillor Sayers present today, have we? Never mind. Okay, welcome, Jazz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as you've said, this is about Auckland Council Group submission to MB's consultation on extending the government procurement rules to apply to a wider set of government entities in the public sector. And the purpose of the consultation is it will inform the policy development process and further advice to ministers. So I won't go through the actual submission document itself, which was circulated by email on Monday, but I will make a few notes in terms of our submission. Firstly, we're doing so as a group, and that includes the feedback from Auckland Transport and Watercare. Other local authorities are also submitting in a similar vein, and I've had some conversations with the likes of Solgum and others who are similarly concerned about the potential wider application of the government procurement rules to local authorities. So the government procurement rules and principles are focused on achieving particular procurement outcomes, and our submission is that we are already achieving those and more as an Auckland Council group through our strong procurement policies and frameworks and practices being driven by the capability that already exists within our organisations. The key points of those procurement outcomes being to be fair, transparent, accountable and sustainable for our communities. Auckland Council, as an eligible agency at the moment, voluntarily participates in all of government contracts, and we have a good working relationship with MB, where we also assist them with some of their policy development. Councils operate within our own legislative environment, which includes the requirements out of the Local Government Act, and we're accountable under the Public Audit Act as well. And we get audited every year around our procurement practices, and I'm pleased to report that we've got a clean bill of health and Audit New Zealand support the work that we've done in our procurement processes so far. There are some risks that we identify, or in fact the whole local government sector is identified in the government procurement rules being mandated across the sector, and those risks include additional compliance requirements, additional reporting, and the potential to require approval from either central government or Treasury for some of our larger procurement initiatives, and that is of concern across the sector. Where council gets funding from central government through Waka Kotahi, for example, or through MB for joint projects like the America's Cup and CRL, we do comply with the rules as a matter of course. Auckland Council Group's size and scale and our procurement capability means that we often achieve better procurement outcomes than can be delivered through centrally procured contracts such as the all of government contracts. We voluntarily participate in a few of those, but more often than not we can get better value for our money ourselves using our own procurement levers. One of the points to note around all government contracts is it actually does cost to participate, so it's not free. If we choose to participate, there's an admin cost of around 1 to 2% of the total spend through those contracts, which then goes towards MB's funding of the structure itself. So there's a risk that mandating rules across all agencies will require a bigger central structure, and there may be more costs associated with that. We understand that there's legal providers who support local government sector are also concerned about introducing potentially new legal issues for local government agencies, which could all add to costs and delays in the future as well. And finally, in terms of Auckland Council, councillors, elected members, we all agree on the policies and outcomes that we want to achieve in Auckland and locally. and we want to be able to innovate in some of our procurement practices and the outcomes that we're looking for, particularly through our social and sustainable procurement guidelines. Having mandated rules may limit that, our ability to innovate in some circumstances. So, Madam Chair, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jazz. Look, Councillor Sayers wanted to move this, but he's not here today, and Councillor Mulholland has asked to move. Councillor Watson is Deputy Chair of Strategic Procurement. Do you want a second? Yes, sure. Right, thank you. Right, questions for Jazz, please. Member Blair.
Kia ora, Jess. I just want to seek some clarification whether you think that the MB procurement rules would likely to restrict He Waka Eke Noa, or what's called Amotai now, because there'd be a concern if it did.
Kia ora, thank you for the question. Through the Chair, I don't believe it would. That's not what the purpose of their consultation is. They're looking just to gather some views while they come up with their policy development. I understand that there is some policy work being done at the moment with Te Puni Kōkiri about introducing targets for Māori spend from the government sector, but that wouldn't, I guess, limit the work that Amotai does at the moment. They are looking to create or engage in an intermediary agency at the moment as well. So that's policy work being done. But I'm pleased to say from an Auckland Council perspective that we're already ahead of the game and we've already got some targets in our sustainable and social procurement guidelines.
Jess, I'm just interested because in Australia the procurement policy is different, and it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, do they have one where they have a certain percentage guaranteed to the Indigenous people over there in their procurement?
Yeah, through the Chair, yes, they do. And we don't have that through central government here at the moment.
I've got a lot of questions, but I'll leave it at that, just around lobbying for that nationally and how Auckland could do that.
Certainly through the Chair, we do support that, and we've been supporting MB with showing them what we've been doing in Auckland and showing them how we could lead the way, and the great work that Amotai does has been working very closely with central government agencies on that.
Right. Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. Jez, in addition to the 1 to 2% that goes to MB for the privilege, have you estimated what the cost of additional reporting for us would be?
Through the Chair, no, we haven't done that because it'll depend on exactly the type of activity that those mandated rules could cover, but it certainly would be, 3-4%. It may require additional staff resource within our own organisations and potentially additional, what's the word I'm looking for, external confirmation around our compliance as well. So that could add cost on cost.
And just to follow up, sorry, Chair, and then delays in the procurement process as well, and the opportunity cost to local providers that we might use now.
Yes, through the Chair, those are all risks that we would face, because if we had to go back and get validation around our procurement plans and approaches in certain circumstances, if we're trying to move quickly to engage local suppliers or to achieve a good outcome, those could be delayed.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Kevin a follow-up to Councillor Dalton, and that is because you've schooled me very well, Acting Chief Financial Officer. Don't approve anything without knowing how much it's going to cost. So my question is to you. If we approve this today, are you confident that we'd be able to pay any costs that go with it? Mr. Chief, Acting Chief CFO.
Confident? No. Because no, for the very reason we don't know what it would be. Yep.
So you're still happy for us to do it? Yeah.
No, we're against it.
You're against it?
Yeah, we're against it.
Through the Chair, the submission's against the rules applying to...
That's what I meant. Yeah, great. Councillor Casey.
Yeah, thanks, Jazz. Yeah, the fact that you didn't know it was against it is what I want to talk about. This is kind of ludicrous. It's again Wellington not knowing what we have here in Auckland, and one of the best things we're doing is social procurement, and it's with the local boards, and it's at their insistence that we use local people wherever possible, we use vulnerable communities wherever possible, and we're doing that really well. Now, that doesn't really come out in this submission, and I just wondered if some politician is going to talk to it, or is it just a written statement?
So through the chair, it's because there's no legislative change, there's no committee that we would front with a submission. It is just informing them of the views of the wider sector. But I'm quite happy, and if with the committee's approval, I'm quite happy to make some tweaks to further enhance the conversation around the better outcomes we're achieving in Auckland already. I do note that that B in the submission allows or delegates to the acting CFO the ability to make some minor tweaks to the submission.
Well, I would like to see some case studies. Just, you know, we're doing some really good stuff, especially in my ward. But we need to they don't know. I know they don't know. And so we need to probably spell out again how it is here with co-governance in Auckland and how we're responding to the local boards. So I would be very happy to add in a few choice words here and there, if it's any help.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would really appreciate that if you'd like to send me anything through that you'd want me to add, but I'm happy to add some examples of the great work that we've done as into the submission itself and circulate that to the committee once we've done that.
And maybe even just a very first bullet point. I know you've got all of that in here, but it's not about the money. For me, it's not. It's about the fact that we're doing it well and we're doing it locally.
Noted.
Yeah, it's about the outcome, isn't it? So, Kevin, are you happy with that? Work with Kathy, yep, okay. Councillor Darby.
Yeah, interesting that point, Councillor Casey, because I'm intrigued as following that line as well, and I guess within this, I'm looking for advocacy for not so much that local component. Well, I guess it is a local component, but just I'm aware that you know, dealing with the main contractor or the master contract is quite appealing. You're just dealing with, you know, top of the tree, and everybody trailing in behind doing all the sub trades is responsible up the chain. I guess what concerns me with just preferring a master contract, you don't get a sense of who your local sub-trades are or your subcontractors that are feeding into that master contract. Invariably, if the master contract has a whole lot of other subsidiary companies, they will have. According to Investopedia, in the corporate world.
Don't ask me.
They will have first digs at you know, being the subcontractors. I don't want to get into a whole contract discussion here, but I am interested in Jazz and others articulating the need to support, you know, the SMEs of Auckland right now, and not just the big corporate guys that are like guys and women that are likely to take the main contracts. You know, ensuring we actually support those SMEs is really important right now. That's where 90% of our business is.
Through you, Madam Chair, I do absolutely agree with that, and through our current procurement policies, guidelines and frameworks at Auckland Council, that is front and centre. The work that we do around our procurement strategies when we have large bits of work that we are taking out to the market, and also looking at across all of our spend categories, we do make sure that we are first and foremost looking at the market in Auckland and how we can make those suppliers sustainable and have a sustainable market of suppliers. And so when we do contract, we do ask for further outcomes as well in terms of subcontracting locally and making sure that they are treating those subcontracts, you know, if there's a principle that they're treating those subcontracts in a fair way as well. So we don't often look through or try to measure that, but we do have some guidelines around what we like to see in the local community as well. But I'm happy to make that a little bit stronger through the submission document.
Thank you for that. Councillor Fletcher, question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was really just going to comment that, I mean, we're all in agreement on this, and Jazz has articulated it in his normal sort of understated, intelligent way, and it's good that Councillor Casey is wanting to give some practical examples here. But what I want to draw your attention to, and it's probably just reinforcing my own prejudice, but yet again, we have a situation where central government clearly doesn't understand what's already happening in the Auckland Council. And my concern has been, and documented on numerous occasions over the last few years, local government New Zealand doesn't really, Auckland is unique in New Zealand. And we can't rely, and we invest very heavily in local government New Zealand, but they are not going to be our advocacy on these things. We have to be our own advocates. So all I want to do is say, good work, Jazz, good work everybody else who's worked on this. But when it comes to local government New Zealand, let's have a much more realistic relationship on what they can and what they can't do for us. So.
Well said, thank you. Councillor Watson and Councillor Cashmore.
Jazz, you made the comment just then that you were happy to make the submission stronger in terms of how it goes to contracting locals and ensuring people are treated fairly, and then implied that perhaps that sort of facility to investigate or follow up, I suppose, is maybe not as visible or accessible as it might otherwise be. I guess what I'm keen to see in all this is a situation where there's a degree of transparency to what costs might be, particularly at the subcontracting level. So we all hear the stories of people ticking the boxes and taking a cut while it's the poor old subcontractor that's doing the work for appreciably lower cost than what may be getting paid the main contractor. How would, or what could happen to open up that aspect of the whole procurement space? How could that be addressed in a way that would ensure that sort of fairness and kind of openness that you alluded to when you commented just a little moment ago?
Thank you. Through the chair. So we have started working across some of our bigger engagements around having nominated subcontractors in some of these contracts. So where we would work with the likes of Amatai, for example, and say that we would like these subcontractors to be part of a main contract, and I know that Auckland Transport has done that recently as well. And in that situation, then there's a contractual mechanism for us to be able to look through the contract and see what's happening. And those are some of the practices that we're looking to evolve further as well. So it's a work in progress.
Follow up in terms of that work in progress. So if examples come up, whatever they might be, that show that this isn't happening or not evolving the way that we would expect, then what is your ability to investigate and to come up with a meaningful conclusion as it might go to decision making?
So through the chair, if there are examples in our current contract, part of the procurement life cycle is also supplier relationship management, so contract management and looking at the overall relationship. And if we are aware that something's not right, we would always have that open and honest conversation with the supplier and be able to get answers and responses and remedial actions if that is what's required.
Final question, in your capacity, you're able to perhaps distance yourself from, in terms of objectivity or investigative follow-up, from parts of the organisation or the main contractor that may or may not have a vested interest in the status quo. Is that correct? I'm just thinking of other parts of council where there is a kind of you know, for want of a better word, an investigative division that has ability to kind of step aside from within to look at matters. Do you have that, or is it still going back to the people who, you know, structure the whole gig?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm not really sure I understand the question. Are you saying whether or not we get involved in the contract management side of things?
I'm just talking about when, you know, contracts in many instances invariably come down to price or what's tendered. It's been some of our experience that often that information doesn't get through in shape and form. If we're looking to cut the best deals, for, you know, in terms of the community, I'm still not sure how that gets through, other than a contractor perhaps making an unsolicited bid, for instance, bring it to people's attention. So I think there's still a number of walls within the current process that stop that kind of accessibility of information that we would expect if we're looking to drive the best deals across the organisation.
Yeah, you're sort of dealing with your committee's detail, I think, in this, but I do take your point. Councillor Cashmore.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Jazz. Did you hold the pen writing that submission, or was?
Yes, and borrowed heavily from some other people who are thinking the same way.
So it's very politely written, I thought, compared to what the actual reality is here. So we have not only led the charge with procurement when we have a set of weightings. It's not all about price, it's about delivery of good outcomes, and part of that is social procurement, part of that is growing SMEs, and part of that is actually getting value for money. And you think of the Project 17 work, Madam Chair, where we actually achieved some really great outcomes by combining contracts and having bigger envelopes. And the point I would make, Jazz, that the government needs to understand really clearly is longer term contracts. Instead of 3+1+1, they're 5+1 or 5+3+1+1. And they're graded all the way through. And talking about other things, we're having alliance-based contracting where it's not a strict tender procurement, especially these uncertain times in a longer time frame. An alliance-based contract like CRL, it enables you to develop relationships with the people who are doing the work, and you can talk through problems and issues as they come up, rather than having very expensive alterations to contracts, people walking away from contracts and people going bankrupt, as we are seeing in Transmission Gully at the moment. If you do get a chance to speak to it, Jazz, emphasise long-term contracting to bring down costs and the weighting system, and some of those good examples that we have actually done, because we know that we've had some really great outcomes from our procurement work, and the team's done. It's always going to be a growing feast, as you've said that yourself many times. We keep altering and moving it to make it better all the way through. We don't need the help of MB in this regard, Madam Chair. We could actually show them how it could be done.
Yeah, and I think if you need help submitting, I think you might like to take Deputy Mayor with you. And well, I know they don't like you, but actually they need to listen to what you've got to say. You don't have to like everyone you work with, Councillor. Sorry, I'm losing the will. Right, Councillor Watson, Councillor Mulholland has added a little extra bit to the recommendations. Are you happy as a seconder with that extra?
Pretty good.
Sorry, I'll take content. Councillor Mulholland, do you want to talk to that?
Yes. Well, I think it's appropriate. We could actually add a few more words given what the fabulous Deputy Mayor has just shared with us. But if the seconder would like to comment, or if the seconder's happy with that, that's good. Yeah. Sorry. Yep.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'll take it to the vote. Oh, no, I won't. Councillor Walker.
Just had another question of Jazz, and it goes like this. Quite obviously, one of our circumstances is a climate emergency. And given that much of what we deliver that goes to carbon is through our contracting, are we in a position where we can make much more aggressive changes to contracts, particularly where there are issues that go across many of our contracts that are geographical?
Is this part of the submission?
Well, yes, it is, Madam Chair.
Really?
Yeah. Well, we've got social procurement. I mean, carbon procurement is inherent in our submission. We mention it. That's what I'm speaking to.
Jazz?
Madam Chair, I can answer that question in that every bit of RFP documents that goes out at the moment as part of our weighted attributes about social and sustainable procurement, we actually ask the question of all the suppliers who submit to say, what are you doing to contribute to Auckland Council's climate action framework goals? And so it can be different, and of course in different contract contexts. If it's construction, it's about reduce carbon in the construction program. If it's a maintenance, it's about what that can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, etc., etc. So that's already part of our current procurement activity, and it's only being enhanced and strengthened for the time being.
Thank you. Look, Jazz, I think you've heard the sentiments around the table, and it's pretty much universally accepted that we support you in what you're trying to do here, but more tangible examples that we can give just to show the difference and help educate, I think, will be very helpful. So we have a mover and a seconder. I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Against? Aye. Carried. Thank you. We'll take a 5-minute break, ladies and gentlemen. Back at 5 past. Thank you. Sorry. Welcome back. Famous legs 11, have we got 11? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
There's some over here.
Yeah. I've just got a message, which I didn't pick up obviously because I was chairing, that Councillor Sayers wants to log in by electronic attendance, so I'd like to move that. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Mulholland. Can you send? Yes. Councillor, thank you. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we now come to our Treasury Management Policy Review. And we have John Bishop with us. John, just before you start, I'd like to cover two aspects around this. In light of some recent media attention, I want to cover the policy itself, why we have it, what it says, and the outcomes, etc. And then I want to look at the outcomes that the policy delivers, especially around the recent, as I mentioned, recent media coverage. So let's deal with the policy first, and I'll hand over to John Bishop. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So look, the policy itself, there's very few changes from the current version which are being proposed. The two changes are simply reflecting the new title for Standard & Poor's, and also under the credit exposure policy, making it clear that when we're looking at our counterparty risk, so the banks and other institutions that we deal with, we first look at the S&P rating and only look at other ratings if they don't have an S&P rating. So that's just a point of clarification. Everything else remains as it was. I do make the point in the paper that we may review it again as we go through the LTP process, depending on where we end up on things like debt parameters, etc. Just touching on the sort of media articles which you've seen to do with our interest rate hedging. I've just got a short sort of presentation here which I'll run through. And at the first slide here, just remind you of the Treasury governance that we have in place. So at the top there we have the governing body in this committee, and they're responsible for approving the Treasury Management Policy, which we're going through today, or the TMP for short. We also have further down there the Treasury Management Steering Group. Now that's a group made up of two independent people and senior financial executives from council parent, and also Watercare and Transport being the larger CCOs. Now that gets its authority from the Chief Executive, and it's managed through a Treasury Management Group Steering Group Charter, which the Chief Executive approves and is reviewed every 3 years, or as required. Now the TMSG, or Treasury Management Steering Group, they also have what's known as the TOM, or Treasury Operating Manual. Now that is a more detailed Treasury policy, but it must be entirely consistent with the Treasury Management Policy which you approve. Now the Treasury Management Steering Group meets throughout the year. It receives monthly reporting from Treasury on aspects of compliance with policy and also performance. This committee here also gets reporting. So in the quarterly reporting pack that you get, you'll get a one-page summary of some of the key Treasury performance areas and compliance with policy. As you'd expect, Treasury is also subject to internal audits. They're generally annually, and those findings go through the Audit and Risk Committee. So it's just a brief overview of sort of the governance framework and the documents which govern our Treasury operation. Now, interest rate hedging. Let's start with the basics. What is interest rate hedging? Now, hedging fixes an interest rate, so we know how much interest, or simply put, cash interest, we have to pay in the future. Now, it can be achieved in two ways, which are economically equivalent. The first is by simply going out there and the council issuing fixed rate debt. So an example of that is our recent 30-year green bond issue, which was fixed at a rate of 2.95%. The second way of doing it is issuing floating rate debt and fixing it with an interest rate hedging contract, or what's commonly referred to as a swap. Now, typically, we use that second method. The reason for that, it's generally considered best practice, and it's also advantageous given our long-term planning horizon. Essentially, what we want with our interest costs is certainty, so we can deliver our services and capital program as planned. Now, while I said that those two approaches are economically equivalent, each has a different accounting rule. So what do these accounting rules mean when it comes to interest rate hedging or swaps? In simple terms, what it means, if interest rates have gone up since the swap was entered into, we will report an accounting gain in our accounts. Conversely, if interest rates have gone down since swaps were entered into, we will report an accounting loss in our accounts. So for the financial year just ended, Auckland Council Group recorded an accounting loss of 756 million on our interest rate swaps. Why do we record that? It's because interest rates went down. In 2017-18, I think we reported gains. Why do we report gains? It's because interest rates went up. Now, the accounting gain or loss is only realised if we were to terminate that swap and revert back to a floating rate exposure. But it's our standard practice to get those swaps in place until maturity. Now, these accounting entries, so these accounting gains and losses, do not change how much interest we pay. So the cash interest that we pay out each year is not impacted by these accounting gains or those losses. That dollar amount doesn't change. So let's look at our interest rate policy. So our interest rate policy is contained in our Treasury Management Policy, which you're looking at today, with more detail in our Treasury Operating Manual, or TOM. Now, this TMP is a requirement of the Local Government Act 2002. So let's look at some of these quotes in the TMP when it refers to interest rate management. Just look at the second one there. We look to prudently manage the Council's borrowings to ensure the avoidance of maturity and interest rate repricing concentrations. Now, why do we do that? I'll give you the example I've given before. If we didn't have any fixed rate cover and we had all our interest rates at floating rates, we've got $10 billion worth of debt and it's growing. If interest rates went up by 1%, our interest costs and our cash interest costs would go up by 100 million per annum. Now, what would that mean? To cover that cost, you would have to increase rates by 6%, or you'd have to cut back on services or some of our capital expenditure program. The next quote there, that the Council prefers predictable interest income and expense to minimise the risk of adverse movements impacting the operating surplus. So again, we have a bias to protecting the upside. While we'd all like to participate in lower rates, our real concern is that interest rate rise, our cash interest costs go up, and we can't afford to do some of the stuff that we planned. The next one there, the primary objective of interest rate risk management is to reduce uncertainty about net interest income or expense as interest rates change. Again, very much along the lines of what I said before. And the last one there, mechanism used include, within risk limits, fixing rates through fixed rate borrowings, as we talked about, and by using interest rate hedging instruments. So these are the swaps that we're going through today. Now, our approach to interest rate risk management, which of course has made the headlines this week, now to be clear, they are the way we operate. It's within our approved policies, so our TMP and our TOM, and always have been. Now, when you get this quarterly report on Treasury, on landscape version there on the bottom left-hand side, that shows you our hedging policy and it shows you our parameters, the minimum amount we must have fixed and the maximum amount, and then the amount of hedging we have in place. So you see that every quarter. Our Treasury Management Steering Group sees that every month. Our approach is consistent with best practice of other large councils and organisations. The policy we put in place too must be applicable across all interest rate cycles. We shouldn't be just adjusting our policy just because interest rates are low. We'd be having a very different conversation if interest rates were at historic highs. Our accounting losses, and they're just accounting losses, are similar to those of other organisations which have large debt portfolios. So relative to the size of their debt book, the mark-to-market on their interest rate derivative position or interest rate swap position will be very similar to ours. Let's be clear, these aren't cash gains or losses. They're simply accounting rules. Like we don't celebrate our gains, we don't celebrate our losses. They're just accounting entries. Also, to be clear, we're not speculating on interest rate movements. Our approach is very similar to what you do is when you go out and take out a mortgage. You go and buy a house, you take out a mortgage at 4%. Interest rates move, they might go up to 5%. They might go up down to 3%. We're locked in at rates just like the homeowner is. We're simply not speculating on whether interest rates go down or up. What we're trying to do is protect our interest costs so we have enough certainty to deliver on those services which council needs to provide on a capital expenditure program. We can't change the fact that interest rates move. They have done and will continue to do. And our approach is conservative. It errs on the side of caution, but we want to protect our ratepayer money. The other thing about these interest rate accounting movements, these gains and losses, they must reverse. The reason for that is that on day one, the market value of a swap we enter into is 0, and on the last day, it is also 0. In between times, as interest rates move, we'll get gains or losses. Now, this is not a John Bishop opinion, it's a fact that, from economic, mathematical and accounting views, any gains or any losses that we see must reverse over the time of those swaps until you hold them to, as long as you hold those to maturity, which is our practice. Look, our approach is also supported by our credit rating agencies. And this is a quote which I'll read out from Standard & Poor's when they reaffirmed our rating less than 2 months ago. And one of the factors the rating agencies look at is our financial management. We get a 1 for that. That's the top rating we can get. And this is what they say here. Auckland's experienced financial management team is successfully managing its financial risks, including debt. So it should be elevated debt levels despite substantial growth and demand for infrastructure in the large city. Its prudent fiscal strategy outlines key policies and financial targets around borrowing limits and liquidity coverage. Reflecting both its size and management capability, Auckland is permitted to borrow offshore. While there are some risks associated with that, we believe they are well managed by the team, and the council hedges all of its foreign exchange and most of its interest rate exposure.
We gave that quote to Matt Nippert, but he didn't think it fitted his scenario, so it was never used.
Look, yeah, I mean, he didn't want to report the facts in a constructive way. It wouldn't have made for a very interesting story. So on that, Madam Chair, I'll hand back to you.
Right, thank you, John. Look, I've got a couple of questions for you. Why are you suggesting we sign off this policy which locks us into a credit rating of AA and delivers on approved financial projections from our LTP and annual plans now, when we haven't agreed the LTP and when COVID-19 is delivering so much uncertainty?
Yeah, through you, Chair. So I believe at the moment the policy remains fit for purpose, but I think I mentioned in the paper, as we do go through this exercise with the LTP and we do look at the levers we can pull, we look at borrowing levels, it may well be appropriate to come back and look at this policy again. Now, as it happens, we tend to review this policy every 3 years. There's nothing stopping us reviewing this policy at more frequent intervals or as required. So if we do make substantial changes in the next LTP as a result of COVID or other factors, it may well be appropriate to again review this Treasury management policy.
Okay, I think that's a very good point. Thank you. My second question is, you've said that you're confident that the policy is still fit for purpose in its current form. What independent advice have you had on the policy and on the Treasury Management Steering Group?
Yes, so on our independent steering group, we have 2 independents, and up until recently we had 3. So again, the Treasury Management Steering Group, they review the Treasury Management Policy, and then they essentially endorse it and recommend it to the Finance and Performance Committee. So it has been reviewed by experienced independent members as well as by senior council staff.
Thank you. And on that note, I'd like to bring to the table Alex Wondergem, who's a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, to provide us with some independent advice as to this policy. So welcome, Alex. I haven't met you before, so please tell us about your background and credentials to assist me give Auckland ratepayers the confidence that we are receiving good, independent, experienced advice on this issue. Thank you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. As the Chair has mentioned, my name is Alex Wondergem and I am a partner at PwC. I have been advising a large number of corporate and local government authorities and borrowers for over a decade now, advising on over sort of 20 billion of debt. That's a range of borrowers from NZX 50 listed all the way through local government, advising around 70 to 80% of all local government debt currently on issue in the country. So I have a reasonable background and experience in treasury management and treasury management best practice.
You've answered my next question. Is this policy commensurate with other large organisations? So you've answered that, so that's great. So in your professional opinion, should we sign this policy off today, and if so, why?
The policy framework that you're operating to and the changes that are being proposed, in particular the changes are relatively minor in nature and more sort of wording tweaks. The current framework is prudent in terms of your approach to interest rate risk management particularly, and the management of your borrowing costs to deliver to your plans and budgets. John Bishop has obviously articulated a number of those reasons, I believe, very clearly in terms of the certainty that's required for an organisation of your nature. You are a risk-averse borrower, you are a prudent borrower. The Local Government Act does require that of you. Your approach is entirely consistent with other large corporates, other council borrowers, both large and small, in terms of the efficient management of your borrowing costs. And the approach is really there to manage the upside and manage adverse risk. Obviously, participation is nice, but the preference is to manage away risks of upside adverse interest cost outcomes.
Thank you. In your professional opinion, does this policy give us enough flexibility within the financial constraints that we have around the COVID-19 situation?
I believe it does, in terms of the policy being the framework that you set to manage your risk, and then within the policy framework there are strategy decisions to be made. As John has mentioned, there is an ability to amend that policy as needed, as and when changes to your plans require the policy to be reviewed once more. But as it currently stands, the policy is fit for purpose and agile enough to provide the flexibility that's needed.
That's good, thank you. And my final question, before I open to everybody else, is there has been some media attention around the so-called $1.4 billion loss. Is the work the steering group is doing with regards to such things as long-term green bonds and fixing interest rates through swaps and therefore locking in a proportion of our interest costs for a period exceeding 10 years the right thing to do or not?
Council is a long-term intergenerational borrower. You're funding and financing assets which have an average life of 50, 60, 70, 80 years. To be managing interest cost and interest expense over that period is entirely prudent to deliver to your plans and your budgets, and to undertake a no surprises approach to your ratepayers, so consistency in terms of those outcomes. The use of interest rate swaps is an extremely common product. It is the most vanilla interest rate product that can be used in terms of a sort of global application, domestic application. It is a very standard product, and the way that those are applied, as opposed to the use of fixed rate loans and fixed rate debt, as John has mentioned, provide the same economic outcomes, rates rise again. So the approach, again, is entirely consistent with best practice of an organisation the nature, size and type as your own.
Thank you, Alex. Look, I really appreciate that. And as you've given such detailed answers, I wondered if you would be willing to speak to media, noting your professional opinion on our behalf.
I'll have to refer that to our media liaison.
Okay, but you don't see a problem with backing up what you're saying in this meeting?
These approaches that have been taken are consistent with best practice.
Thank you. Right, we've got other questions. I have Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Coombe, Councillor Casey and the Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is to all of us, but I do have a specific question for Alex. And the question is, this comes to the heart of our responsibilities in terms of governance. And I've taken an interest in these issues for quite some time. I had the privilege of serving for a number of years on the board of Auckland Transport. And I spent hours of time along with the board giving consideration to hedging. And we were the beneficiary, if you like, of the original EMUs because of hedging. You know, it would have turned disastrously wrong for us. So my difficulty is that I want to know, you know, and we all have to own our policy on these things in order for us to have the backs of our officers, and I want to back our officers in this situation. But the questions that I asked, going back to the years on the board of Auckland Transport, is why are they so controversial? We all know that Warren Buffett thinks they're time bombs. You know, he's been saying stuff like that right the way through the last 10 years. Perhaps from your perspective, Alex, can you help for those of us who have not spent a lot of time looking at the issue of hedging? Why are they so controversial?
Happy to speak to that. And I think part of the reason is perhaps, as you mentioned, a sort of lack of understanding of the product and its use. To Warren Buffett's comments that he's made, derivatives, which can be sort of labelled a slightly dirty word, is where they're used in a context of financial engineering or for speculative activity. What council employs derivatives and particularly interest rate swaps is the opposite, is to provide certainty and security over outcomes. An interest rate swap essentially provides a fixed rate contract. It is exactly akin to a fixed rate loan, albeit it comes with additional flexibility, which provides a sort of preference as opposed to fixed rate debt. The controversy, I believe, comes through these accounting standards which require a revaluation of an interest rate product, whereas a fixed rate loan does not require a revaluation. And I believe that's where the controversy stems from, is a misunderstanding about a realised versus unrealised gain or loss reported, albeit the economic outcomes are exactly identical.
So, Madam Chair, I think, as I said at the beginning, this comes to the heart of our responsibilities of governance. We need to go into these things with our eyes wide open, caveat emptor, you know, let the purchaser in this case be aware, and then be willing to back our officers if this is our policy that we have adopted. So it's not just one that we can fob off and somebody else's problem. This was an actual policy that we endorsed, and I think we have to live with the consequences, because there will be negatives and there will be positives, as if you take I think you used the term intergenerational or longer term perspective on it. So I thank Alex for the interpretation that he has given, and I would really encourage other councillors and members to really do a bit more of a deep dive into this issue, because it's really complex.
It is, and that's why I invited him, because he's very clear.
And I think it would be very helpful for there to be some documentation on those occasions when council was, and the council whānau, you know, the CCOs and so forth, where it can be demonstrated the advantage of this policy And I mean, I've got first-hand experience with some, but I think perhaps this committee could have a little bit more of a breakdown. Maybe, John, you could provide some other examples that would be helpful and inform, so that when we adopt the policy, we own the policy.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Coombe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tēnā kouroa. That was a really useful overview and very clearly presented, thank you. And I just wondered, is it going to be packaged in a way that we can share that? Because obviously I've been receiving emails from grumpy constituents, and to be honest, I was grilled in a very aggressive way by a board member at the Waitemata local board meeting the other day about this issue. So I'm just very keen to have, you know, a clear statement that I can share, which I'm hearing from the chair that's where we're heading to, but I just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah, through you, Chair, there's a sort of a Q&A on, I think it's on Our Auckland, which has been published, which gives the basic sort of facts of what we do and why.
Yeah, just to add to that, Councillor, I've asked Tam to transcribe the answers to the questions I put forward, and I'm happy to circulate those.
Oh, great. And presumably this presentation is going to be on the minutes. Yeah. And sorry, just a second question. Is this the opportunity to ask about the actual policy?
Absolutely,
John?
yes.
Yeah. Just in terms of, and I guess I just need some direction though, Chair, around, because I sort of want to draw it on what we were given an update yesterday in the workshop, but that was confidential workshop about the debt to revenue. So I just want to know how that then interfaces with this in terms of our prudential limits.
I know what you're saying. We've got to just be very careful. Can I just hold that question till this afternoon? I'll ask if that's this afternoon when we have our workshop. Right?
Okay. So it's a query around the wording. Thanks.
Councillor Casey.
Mine is actually a question for the Mayor, and it's to do with the Herald's 3 articles, Matt Nipper and Brent Melville, and reporting of David Cunliffe. Some of the language used in those articles undermines the policy of this council. So I want to know that we've had a look at it, and if there is any possibility of making a complaint to the Press Council with regard to the undermining.
Yeah, I'm a great admirer of investigative journalism, but too often those posing as investigative journalists are simply after a sensational headline. And that's what we got. I've got it here. It was exactly what I predicted Kevin Ramsey we'd get, even though a full explanation had been given. It was going to be a front page story, but something like COVID-19 came along. I didn't arrange that for the event, but Council's rate hedge bet a disaster. 1.4 billion Auckland's council's bad bet, and then Cunliffe slams loss, describing it as incompetent. I have vague memories of the gentleman. I won't go there because that's exactly what the media would want me to do. But it is really unfortunate. You know why. It's really unfortunate. And I think that it is potentially damaging to people that don't understand these things, which is why, Alex, I think it's important that somebody who is a partner in one of the biggest consultancies for accountancy and financial management in the world actually puts something out there to say, I'm sorry, this is the perspective of 3 individuals that he's handpicked and chosen, and not the perspective, Kathy, of what the mainstream of the accountancy and financial management world might be. And I think it is potentially damaging. When we gave that quote from Standard & Poor's, I gave that to the Herald. They declined to run it. I was asked last night whether I would take up Mr Cunliffe's advice of inviting the Officer of Auditor General, and I pointed out that the Officer of Auditor General audits our books on a regular basis. He does it annually, and he attends and meets with the committee members of Audit and Risk quarterly, and there has never been an occasion where the Auditor General has raised this issue with us, and if there was a material risk because we were incompetent and following a disastrous policy, I would have imagined that the organisation responsible for auditing us would have drawn our attention to it. That has never been used as an issue, raised as an issue with Council. So the short answer is you probably won't get very far with the media or the Press Council. I understand that officers may be raising some questions about the presentation. But I just want to finish on this note. I don't always agree with letters to the editor, but there's a really good one that I'd invite people to read in today's paper. And the individual talks about what hedging is for and why you have it. And he makes this comment at the end. If I'd known when I bought my house 25 years ago that it would still be intact and standing today, I wouldn't have wasted all that money of insurance premiums. Yeah, look, it may be that we waste our money on insurance, but if the house burns down, that's why we have it. Why do we hedge? We hedge because the interest rates can go either way, and if it goes the other way, the losses aren't paper losses, they're real losses. And it really is a shame that we didn't get a more balanced account. It was clear to me from the article yesterday, keep asking me for comment because he wants to beat up the story even further. You know, Cunliffe versus Gough. Well, I'm not interested in that sort of bullshit. I want to get clear, clean reporting, and it's the obligation of any reporter, in my view, to provide a balanced account of what he or she is writing about, and we certainly didn't get that.
Honest account.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
It was a long answer, and if you'd like to give me Mr Cunliffe's contact details, I'm more than happy to write him a letter. Councillor Watson.
I think a few of us might. Sorry, I did have a question. Yeah.
Oh, did you? Sorry.
Yeah, and it is to Alex. How does our policy, in terms of the way we hedge our debt, because it is a large debt, how does that compare to comparable borrowers, either other large councils, which won't be comparable in New Zealand, they'll be much smaller, but with corporates? Do they pursue the same sort of hedging to protect their position?
Absolutely they do. Your policy is very consistent with best practice management for other local authorities and large corporate borrowers, and indeed what the central government borrows entirely on a fixed rate basis.
Thank you for that. So when somebody from an organisation called Wigram Capital, I presume that's on the same scale as PwC, is it?
No.
Thank you, Worship. I don't think Alec can answer that question, but I think it's rhetorical.
PwC employs more than 250,000 people around the world. I'm not quite sure how many people Rodney Jones employs. But when you get that, and then you get comments from a retired politician, such as we get, we do really need to have... I mean, I can go out and say, I've got great confidence in John Bishop and our Treasury team, which I do have, but then they will say, I would say that, wouldn't I? I would really ask you to talk with whoever you need to in your organisation, you're a partner of that organisation, to have the opportunity to put an op-ed in to explain from an outside perspective with considerable expertise and the backing of your very large organisation that this is not a disaster, this is not incompetent, this is an orthodox, maybe a little conservative way of managing your risks and protecting the ratepayer against real losses. So if you could do that for us, that would be really appreciated. It is a third-party, independent, expert view, and I'm sorry that you weren't contacted by Mr Nippert when he wrote the articles.
Thank you, Worship. Councillor Watson.
I mean, just to that last point, Alex, your firm is one of those that is retained by council, is it? You're one of the private sector experts. Okay, so you know, if all I would say in respect of that if you feel moved to do that, then that should be of their own volition. I don't think it should be at our prompting, because there is a perception issue there in terms of the relationship between us and council. Just going to you, John, and you mentioned about the accounting entries and how 2017-18 were one of gains, and then the last 2 years have been ones of losses. I would have thought, and this might be overly simplistic, but I would have thought one of the best measures to rebut the general tenure of the article would have been some analysis of how it's worked out over the last 10 years. Why didn't that occur?
Look, through you, Chair, look, I've spoken to this particular reporter 3 times, been gone through the same information 3 times, given him the same facts and figures, but he will choose to report what he wants. He's got the pen, unfortunately.
So what does it work out as, John? If we're going to balance it up, what does it work out of?
The gains and losses overall?
Yeah.
The net position now, given where interest rates are, and so this is a look-forward approach. So technically speaking, we're looking at all our cash flows out in the future at fixed rates and discounting them back at today's low rates. The figure at the moment, or at the end of September, is about 2.7 billion. But as I said before, we held those contracts to maturity, which we will. We're going to see a net $2.7 million gain come through over the next 10 to 14 years. And that's the way it has to work. That's an economic and accounting and mathematical fact.
So we can't do it on the years that have already gone by and deal with the decade. They refer to, it's this being in operation since the inception of the super city.
Yeah, it gets a little bit tricky because obviously some interest rate hedging contracts which we had in place then have matured, etc., etc. So it's hard to do an exact comparison like that. But again, the information has been shared with Mr. Nippert. I mean, he asked about the highest individual swap that we had, which we gave him. We also pointed out that some of our swaps that we have are less than 1.3%. But he didn't choose to report that.
And this item today has been billed as something of an examination of the articles as much as the actual policy. I've got a kind of question that goes to both, and it goes to some of the comments that were made by the people in the articles, which do have policy implications in some respects. The first gentleman criticism really referred to the notion of all the long-term debt with a large chunk being tied up for a decade, and he referred to that as being extremely aggressive. So I guess what I would appreciate clarification on is the length of these arrangements, and whether that decade outlook is wise, notwithstanding what you've said about Council's precautionary approach.
Through you, Chair. So if you look at the extent of our interest rate hedging, so the fixed rates which extend beyond 10 years, it's 2.9 billion. Now in 10 years' time, our debt's forecast to be around 15 billion, because it extends beyond our current long-term plan. So that is, only about 20%. When you go out past 14 years, we've got interest rate hedging contracts for only about 290 million. So again, it's a very, very low percentage of our forecast debt at that time. So again, the prudent thing to do with low interest rates at the moment, and likely over the next few years, would be to add to that hedging out in that time period, so it does give us some certainty when we get out 8 or 10 years. And if you go forward 10 years' time and we only had $2.9 billion worth of cover, and interest rates were back up where they were, say, 10, 15 years ago, the question will be asked, well, why didn't you put more fixed rate hedging in place when rates were so low?
Final question I've got, changes tact a little bit, goes to the actual policy, and I think someone yesterday, and it goes to liquidity in our policy. And someone referred yesterday to, we don't have a rainy day fund. Well, we did have a rainy day fund a couple of years ago, so it amounted to $335 million. And at that time, the comment was made in our agenda item about the possibility of having to replace that liquidity that fund provided. So I guess two questions. One, was or has that diversified assets portfolio fund, has that been replaced in any way in terms of liquidity? And secondly, in terms of the clauses going to liquidity, are we meeting the requirements of that section of the policy?
Yeah, through you, Chair. So there's two ways which you have liquidity. One, is, as you correctly point out, is you have a pool of cash or assets which you can call upon. The other way is you have what's known as standby facilities. So they are facilities with banks, which means that for a payment of an upfront fee, like I guess an insurance premium, we have access to draw down funds as required. Now we have about $1.3 billion of those facilities with a range of 10 banks. And if we needed to, so if we couldn't access money through the normal debt capital markets, such as was the case sort of during the GFC, then we could access those bank standby facilities. So when we look at our liquidity policy, we have to have either cash or standbys up to a certain level, and it's typically a 6-month time frame, so we have to have enough cash or standby facilities to meet our forecast requirements, including maturing debt in the 6-month time horizon. That policy itself is also in our Treasury Operating Manual and is monitored on a regular or monthly basis, and we've always been compliant with that.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Darby.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Look, it's a pretty big issue. Credit to Mr. Nippert, because he's got me a lot more engaged, as I should be. We are on our borrowings and rates, hedging, swaps and derivatives, and it goes on. And look, the journalist has gone to a number of sources, and while I do wonder about some of the sources and their intent, and by the way, thank you to Treasury and PwC for your account today. People are always wanting a few column centimetres as well, and I know that one of the commentators is quite a small provincial company of just 4 people, that it appears. That aside, that person might be extremely well qualified to comment. The fact that it's just a 4-person company doesn't say that that person doesn't have the skills. And then he's contacted a former Minister of the Crown, finance spokesperson at one stage, but I'm also aware that Mr. Cunliffe's a Harvard graduate, he's a Fulbright scholar, and he did work at Boston Consulting, and from everything I've read, he is qualified to comment as well. So Mr. Cunliffe's made some statements, some pretty strong statements, mentioning, incompetency, etc. He's put himself out there as the fountain of truth, as have other commentators, and we've got to some of the truth here today, and I have absolute confidence in what I'm hearing. But I'm just wondering where Aucklanders might be right now and how we close this off. And while the Office of the Auditor General does come in and audit, they haven't been asked specifically to take a look at this issue. And I'm just wondering on this issue and the questions raised through media and commentators in the last week, that they actually specifically look at this. Now, I've talked to our Director of Finance about this. I mean, I did think, you could go to one of the other 4, obviously not PwC, big 4 accounting firms, either Deloitte or EY or, forget the other name, KPMG. Or you could go to the OAG and just look at a way of closing this off. Because I think we can defend this, and we've got good feedback here today, but how do we give Aucklanders the confidence that there's another final check to this? So my question is, do we deliberately refer this to the OAG?
Sorry, we're just talking while you asked your question. I know where you're going. You're taking a long time to say it, and I know where you're going, so apologies. But first of all, I want to go to Councillor Cashmore from Audit and Risks perspective, and then I'll come to Kevin from Finance perspective.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've been on Audit and Risk Committee since 2013, and I can confirm that this question around these swaps of derivatives have been asked of the Auditor General every time. Every year, basically to comment on it, and there's sometimes a 1 or 2 line commentary in the auditor's report. There's been nothing to show that any of the work that we're doing has been done towards. So the questions have been asked and has been commented on by the auditor, both the current one and the one who's recently retired.
Thank you. Kevin, do you want to add to that? Do you want to ask him specifically?
Oh, look, we have external expertise in Treasury, obviously by appointing a treasurer, and we actually have independence, and you can see the calibre of the people we do have there. We have an independent Audit and Risk Committee chair and members, and including, interestingly, one of those independents is actually ex-OAG themselves. So we do have a lot of access to information ourselves. One of the concerns I'd have with going out suggests you think there may be a concern. So no matter how you actually word it, there will be a perception that it's being raised for a reason. We do have that audit and Risk Committee for this very purpose. If we wanted to go back there and have another conversation there, we could do so. There is independence appointed to both our Treasury Management Steering Group and our Audit and Risk Committee for this very reason.
So my concern is, look, there's been quite a few column centimetres on this. There's been a lot of radio time on this. It's been on, Checkpoint, Morning Report, and print media, and there might be more. And I'm looking at how we resolve it. So what is our strategy to resolve it and give confidence to Aucklanders that we have undertaken the right processes? Rather than just telling them it's all hunky-dory.
Well, Madam Chair, I've suggested a couple of courses. One, we engage the services of PwC because of their status as a company and their competence, and therefore I think a comment coming from them, because they have the responsibility for looking at and advising us on these issues. We need to know the sort of thing that's never appeared in those newspaper columns. For example, if I'm quoting you correctly, Alex, that this is standard practice for large corporations. This is not unusual. I never read that in any of the articles. Sue Sheldon is deliberately appointed as an independent chair of Audit and Risk. She is exceptionally well qualified and experienced in this area, and her responsibility as the chair of that committee is to ensure that we are doing these things in a competent and professional way. One, I'm sure she would have spoken out if she did not believe that. But secondly, Madam Chair, she may be another person who could be asked upon to give comment. Why I'm worried about this is because it seems that the people who are quoted have been selected specifically to build up the story, and that other people that have been referred to and other quotes, such as the one on the screen in front of us, have been deliberately omitted. I don't mind any person looking to see whether we're doing our job competently, but I do expect them, when they do that, to do it in a balanced and a professional way. That's all I'm asking.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm going to hand now to as you've quite rightly said, the Chair of Audit and Risk is independent for the very reason that we need them to be. But the Deputy Chair is Councillor Newman. So Councillor Newman, would you like to comment, please?
Look, thank you, Chair. I think the discussion is interesting, but I'm not quite sure what we hope to achieve out of, an approach to the Office of the Auditor General. I wouldn't support that, but the reality is I don't believe that we can necessarily guarantee the right narrative within the media. What we can guarantee is that our approach to Treasury management is prudent. It is demonstrably prudent. It is designed to give the best resilience to the Council's financial position now and in the future. And we enjoy the confidence of professional organisations who advise us. That's what we can say. We can't guarantee that that's going to be reported. We can't guarantee that we can shape public opinion based on what's published in the media. And frankly, I'm not sure that I want to. Because if we can't guarantee the narrative, then the best we can do is to continue to apply a Treasury policy which is appropriate for Auckland Council and which reflects best practice, which gets us a clean audit, which it does. And that, Madam Chair, I think is the beginning, the middle and the end of the matter. We can issue a press statement on this. Rating agencies will have their view. We ought to be fairly conservative, and we are, but I'm not quite sure what we are hoping to achieve, which is realistic. There is a limit to what the media will publish. I accept that the media will often be motivated by a narrative which is not necessarily one we would like. But you know, if we were going to live based on the favourable versus unfavourable headlines, I would suggest that the council's going to be in a permanently defensive position. So I think that the discussion is interesting, Chair, but I want to commend the officers on this occasion for the approach that we have taken. I'm sorry that we have hit the headlines unfairly, in my view, on this occasion, but I think that we ought to consider the feedback we've received. We've got a paper, we've passed the paper, and we continue to endorse the strategy that has been undertaken and have confidence in people like Sue Sheldon to do the work that she does as a chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, and we will receive her recommendations in due course.
Thank you, Councillor. And I think the purpose of today, just reminding everyone what the purpose of today is to give you confidence, because you're making a decision. You have to have confidence, and I've asked specifically for independent advice. You have to have confidence in approving the policy that is on the agenda. All right? What happens next for Aucklanders? Look, that's often not in our hands. But to assist you, talk to the people that in your wards, we will give you some information to back that up based on the information we've been given today. So we have another question now from Councillor Collins. Can you hear us, Councillor? Marlo, Councillor Collins. Hello. Nope, Councillor Walker.
Hello,
Oh,
hello.
yes, hello.
Sorry about that. I was pushing the wrong button.
Hello, we can
Thanks,
hear you.
Chair. I've got a few questions. I may have missed this in the presentation, but I just wondered for my own confidence that you've noted, Chair. Can I get an explanation again as to why why we would restrict or maintain the current debt ceiling of 270? I've read the paper, but I'm just interested in, and I understand the idea of prudence, but I'm just interested if there was anything else I had missed in the presentation as to why we would keep our debt as a percentage of revenue at below 270.
Yes, through you, Chair. So the 270 was an historical figure based on the S&P methodology they used to have, and they were pretty black and white at that stage that anything above 270% was inconsistent with the AA rating. Those who've seen things have moved on since then, and I think, look, as part of the discussions we'll have during the LTP process, it's one factor we'll continue to look at and see with a whole raft of other sort of financial levers, see what sort of makes sense for council, bearing in mind that we do wish to maintain that AA rating.
So, Councillor, just to supplement that answer, it may be that we make some amendments once we have landed or about to be landed on our new LTP. All right?
And thanks for that extra bit of explanation there, Chair, because one of the questions, the next one I was leading into was, at what stage would we need to formally review it if we got to the point where there may be an issue that means we have to look at a higher debt ceiling level?
So before or after you land the LTP, John?
Through you, Chair, so if we did reach that situation, then we would have to formally review this policy. That's correct, before or as part of the LTP process.
Okay, Councillor?
Yeah, cool. One other question was, in the discussions that I had in setting the strategy or agreeing to maintain the strategy, is there a considered notion as to the level of rates? Because the bottom of page 3 talks about where our income, which is rates, is used as security, but every so often there might be a lender that says we want a bit more for security. So does our rates level have an impact in the considerations at setting this policy?
Through you, Chair, not in itself. I mean, security offered to lenders is our rates income and future rates income. The power of that, of course, is that if we did get into any financial difficulty, we could increase rates by a considerable amount, and people would have to pay that. So that's the power of the security, but the actual level of rates itself probably doesn't influence these policies.
Thanks. And just finally, Chair, my last question is, was there any discussion at any time in the committee around any persons or presentations where people were giving thought to radically departing from the strategy as it is at the moment, because it's pretty much the same and it's been reset to the same level? So was there any consideration to radically depart from any parts of this strategy?
Do you mean from the Treasury Management Steering Group?
Yes.
Through you, Chair, look, there's always debate and discussion at the Treasury Management Steering Group about what's appropriate. I guess back to my earlier point, what we're conscious of is that this policy needs to stand the test of time, and we don't want it to be reactionary to when interest rates or exchange rates or something get to either very low or elevated levels. So, we're conscious it's a long-term policy, and we don't want to sort of play around with it just because interest rates are low for a couple of years, or conversely if they're high for a couple of years.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker.
So just a question of the PwC gentleman. Is it fair to say that there are probably any number of black swan events that could cause interest rates to go either up or down? And recently we've seen a big one, which has been COVID. But equally, there are a large number of others, aren't there?
Absolutely there is, and I think that supports John's comments previously that he's just made, in fact, around the policy needing to be fit for purpose for all weathers. So yes, whilst there is a particular scenario at the moment where interest rates are low, that could easily be the opposite, and should inflation move materially higher, interest rates will follow that higher, and council would be protected against that interest rate movement, which is why the policy needs to have that long-term approach to it and not knee-jerk reactions to particular interest rate settings as they are currently, because as you've pointed out, particular events can occur, such as COVID, such as the global financial crisis, which are not predictable and can have a very meaningful impact in terms of interest rate settings and therefore interest costs. And so council's ability to employ a policy that is fiscally prudent over a long-term horizon is entirely appropriate.
Thank you. Councillor Sayers, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, Madam Chair. Thank you. Probably my questions to PwC. We just heard that the debt, forecast debt for Auckland Council is projected to get up to around 14 or 15 million over time. And obviously, at the moment, I think we're paying about 1.2 million a day in interest fees. So, what options are there for councils around that debt? Like, does council have to just keep increasing that debt level without repaying back capital, or is that something that councils don't do? They just keep it on the books forever and just to keep increasing that that debt level. So, Madam Chair, my question is just around what options do councils have to operate with paying down debt rather than increasing debt?
Alex?
And that is really a decision that's made by each individual local authority in terms of their long-term objectives around particularly infrastructure spending, growth in the community, service level deliverables, asset disposals that may bring down debt, where rates changes may be able to facilitate repayment of debt, or where continued capital expenditure programs suggest additional financing will be needed. So in terms of what is a optimal or sustainable debt level, that is very much a sort of dependent on each council's individual scenario that they are facing, and so there's no one rule fits all there, and I can say that other local authorities across the country are asking themselves a similar question: what is our right level of debt? Do we have a plan for debt repayment, or with the current rate environment, do we borrow further?
You're right with that, Greg?
Yes, and look, I thank the gentleman for the answer and to elaborating on it what other councils were considering as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And final question, Councillor Coombe.
Oh, thank you. I think this is for you, Madam Chair, in terms of approving the policy. I'm just concerned about the wording that we were talking about before and what Councillor Collins mentioned as well about the debt as a percentage of revenue in the table, because it does say the council's prudential limits are. So by saying that it's 270, it means that anything higher or lower or higher is not prudent, which isn't the case when we've considered the emergency budget. So I just have a concern about that wording as locking us into, if we're following the policy when we go into the 10-year budget deliberations, we are being forced into a, well, we're not actually going to, it's going to make it more difficult for us to comply with that policy. Does it just want to make sure we're really satisfied that wording is not creating difficulties?
John?
Yeah, through you, Madam Chair. Look, I think as we go through the LTP process and we find that we want to live with a different debt to revenue level or other changes, then at that time we can make those changes and adjust this policy.
Yeah, sorry, but when we're having our deliberation, if the policy currently says this, then and we're asked to say talk about going higher, the policy says that's not prudent. It's implied in the wording. I mean, it's almost like it needs to be. It needs to say something as a footnote. This is what they are. What is prudential? Subject to other considerations, for example, like what we did during the emergency budget process, which meant that we did set a higher level, so which I don't think we all felt was imprudent. Sorry, it's the lawyer in me looking at that wording and not liking it.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just pick it up through the chair. Look, I understand what you're saying. Sometimes, though, what you want to do is actually still state that under normal circumstances, based on the policy and the strategy we have in front of us, 270 is the prudent level. If you're going to move outside of that, you have to have a prudence conversation, and that's what we did. We went out in a consultation document, went out in our final adopted document, which said 270 we deemed to be the prudent level. We have consciously made a decision to go beyond that for 290 for 1 year because under the circumstances it was prudent to do so in those circumstances. So I understand what you're saying, and yep, the legal nuances there, which is you can either do it up front and actually say there might be good reasons not to go 270, or you can say 270 is where you should be. Now let's explain if there's a circumstances, for 1 year in our case, why it was prudent not to do so. And we've taken that second approach. But I can understand what you're saying. It's just whether you want to make too many provisos in the actual policy, because they'll never cover every eventuality.
Thank you. Good point, though. I think you make a good point. Member Blair and then Councillor Fletcher.
I know mine was a comment, not a question, so...
Okay, Councillor Fletcher.
I know that we canvassed this at the beginning of the session, but I'm pleased you've got the recommendations up now. We only, as I said before, I want to back our officers. We need to have a coherent policy, and I've got quite a bit of sympathy with Councillor Coombe. Could the CEO, who is our employee, tell us why we have to adopt this today in as clear a way as he can? Because there strikes me as being quite a strong argument for deferring this until such time as we have more information. And I don't want to make things difficult for officers, but I would like the CEO to give me the comfort of knowing that it's a non-negotiable to have to adopt this today. Otherwise, I would prefer to see it being deferred until such time as we have a bit more information.
Thank you. The amendments proposed to the existing Treasury management policy are minor in nature, and I think for the purposes of today are a reflection of how we operate today. I don't think there's any risk in accepting them today, nor would I think there is much to be gained by deferring them. I think to the point that Kevin and John have made, while I recognise the questions that councillors have asked, I do think we would need to consider the circumstances under which we might want to contemplate any other changes to the Treasury management policy and do that in a more considered way in the future.
Thank you. Comment, is it? No? Nothing. Comment then, final comment from Member Blair.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm confident in the policy because we're managing the risk of an organisation of this size. It's a long-term view, and we have over 1 million people we're looking after, and I'd hate us to enter into a short-term view over financial management because, in my opinion, we're looking after the social, cultural, health and well-being of our citizens, and anything that's a short-term view around financial management would not be advisable, I would imagine. It's the most vanilla product to use and a product that also allows some flexibility, so I'm comfortable we utilise this in my role as a director on a tribe where we're of that size to be able to apportion some of the percentage into swaps, and it is an accounting term and not, and to the general public who don't understand accounting terms, it can be an inflammatory story which people can run off with and take to wherever they want. So I guess it's around a communication piece around what this is. I'm very comfortable because when we manage risk, it's in the best interest of who we represent, and the opposite strategy would I wouldn't be able to support. So, Madam Chair, I think I've heard an excellent explanation externally as well as internally, and the leadership around the structure of how we manage it is something which I'm very comfortable with. So thank you, Madam Chair. That's my comment.
Thank you, Member Blair. And I've got one sneaking in from Councillor Watson.
Yes, thank you, and I will be brief. And I think Member Blair has made some very pertinent comments there, a very practical analysis of the situation. But I think Councillor Darby did raise a good point, and I'm not sure we've actually addressed it, that this particular issue has to be set in the wider context of what we're going into over the next few months, and that is, one in which every penny is meant to be a prisoner. So I think it's very important that in that context that we do address the concerns that have been raised here. There's people of some substance who've made very public comments that don't reflect too well on council. We're not going to change our policy for the very reasons that were outlined in response in some of these articles, but that doesn't mean to say that we don't or we shouldn't feel compelled to explain things as clearly as we can to the public. The analogies in these articles and the comments here today have been made to ordinary homeowners, and ordinary homeowners can understand mortgages and loans. Those same homeowners will understand what it's like when they fix at a set rate and the interest rates drop. They're maybe not quite as philosophical or taking quite as long-term a view as we are in our policy. So we should be honour bound in something of substance of this. These are big figures to go back and to explain that as clearly and to answer specifically the criticisms that were made in the article, because in terms of both the length of the loans and the amount of debt that's involved is very substantial, of course has far wider repercussions than an ordinary homeowner. So I don't feel just content just to let it rest there. Councillor Darby asked, well, what is the strategy or what is the response going forward? We've had some comments in the paper. We've had other, apparent, reluctance to comment, and I'm just going on the basis of the article here. So I think given those circumstances, that we should be using all avenues to spell out our policy, to spell out the long-term view, and to take the assurance we have absolutely been given that in the long term and the swings and roundabouts, that this will be the prudent course and advantageous to council. I don't think it's enough just to leave it, particularly at a time when interest rates are so low and the assumption is that will continue for some time. So I'm not quite sure what the response is there, Madam Chair, but I think there needs to be an informative response and not just satisfying ourselves within these four walls. There is a bigger public out there, and we need to explain ourselves more accurately and more persuasively than we've done to date.
Thank you, Councillor. I don't think anyone disagrees with you, and if you remember that I made a commitment to give you, all councillors, a copy of the transcript for today. We are preparing, because obviously, in bringing Alex to the table today, we were very aware that first of all, as councillors, you needed that independent advice and confidence to vote on this item. But you're quite right, the second stage is to translate that into real language that the normal that Aucklanders can understand, and I think that's the comms work that we will do next. Once you've received your transcript from today and some Q&As, I think if you've got any concerns further that you have to be able to deal with questions or concerns from your constituents, please come through me or straight to Kevin, and we'll. It's already on all of our Auckland, is it? Yep. Already up. Yep. So we are anticipating that. Obviously, we need a response, and we've done something towards that. Councillor Darby.
Look, just to close this off, I'm still a little bit unsure as to what the way forward is on this question that's been raised through media. So now, Kevin, you said that there could be reputational risk if we referred it to the OAG. In some ways, would there not be reputational risk if we maybe didn't refer it and then a private citizen did? Because a private citizen could. Does it go both ways?
I think what's been really articulated nicely here in this room is there's really two levels to this, isn't there? One is the assurance that you as the governors believe we're operating appropriately, and you have various mechanisms to do that, including the OAG's responses back to our Audit and Risk Committee, Audit and Risk Committee itself, the Independent Treasury Management Steering Group members, and that group itself. So one is the confidence you have, the assurance that you have been given, which is really the fundamental purpose for today. The second level is what we now look to do beyond what we've already done, which is our Auckland is a published Q&A thing around why hedging occurs in our environment. We can look at whether elaborate on that based on the transcript from today, circulate that to you and see if that's useful information for you to now share, hopefully, your confidence to our public about that we are doing the right thing here.
Okay, so the suggestion, Chair, is to refer it to the Chair audit, not just to the audit committee, but in her independent role as chair of audit, to look at the questions that have been raised publicly and to comment on it in her role as chair. Is that what you were suggesting? Because
Yes.
Yeah.
I won't speak on behalf of the chair, but yeah, through the chair. Look, no, obviously there are some other options available there. There's been suggestions made around some op-ed pieces and things. We'll explore those as well and see if there's some opportunities there to simplify the language and explain it clearer, as Councillor Watson has suggested.
Madam Chair?
Yeah. Your Worship.
Yeah, look, there are three professional sources of oversight over what we're doing in this area. One is the membership of the advisory committee, on which we have an appointed person who is a partner of PwC. He will have had the opportunity to look at this, to comment on it, and he would have been very good balance had he been included in the article. He wasn't included. Secondly, we have appointed, I think, a very good person as chair of audit and risk, widespread respect for her, and wide experience in auditing these things. And you would have to believe that if we were doing something, quote unquote, that was incompetent or a disaster, that she might have commented on that when she cast her eye regularly over the way that we manage these things. Thirdly, we've heard from the Deputy Mayor that for 7 years this has been an issue that has been discussed with the Auditor General, and the Auditor General has never raised a material concern with this body as to the way in which Treasury follows the process of managing this risk. So there are three professional sources and informed sources that we rely on to ensure that we've got this right, as well as the confidence that we have in dealing with our Treasury management team that we deal with frequently, and therefore we make some assessment about their competence to do their jobs. I don't believe that we need to go further than that. I would like to see balance in the comment and the analysis that has been made. And of course, we will keep our Treasury management policy under scrutiny as we go along to find out whether we can and should be doing things differently. But there's a big difference between making adjustments to a policy, which we should always be asking questions about, than accepting the sort of sensational headlining that we've received in the paper. We will follow a prudent policy of continuing to ask questions and to see whether this management of our debt and our hedging is done in the best possible, best practice way, but we should not be knee-jerk reacting to sensational headline stories that had the opportunity to provide balance but never took it.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, look, no one's moved that, so maybe because we've been commenting, but do you want to move that, Madam Chair?
Happy to move it.
And
Would you like to second it, Councillor?
Yeah, look, I'll second. I'm confident with the Treasury management policy refinements. And look, I think the main point today is we're going forward on a very different looking budget. We'll be asking people possibly for targeted rates, and there'll be a range of things there. It's going to be a different looking budget, and I think Councillor Watson was alluding to that. You know, we need to go forward and have that discussion with Aucklanders from a foundation of them having some confidence, and these things come to test us, and we need to face up to them. You know, criticism is a healthy thing. And
criticism's a healthy thing.
Criticism, I'll repeat it then. Criticism is a healthy thing if it's constructive criticism, and sometimes it comes at us with barbs attached as well. And then you just got to deal with that. I'm not going to keep having a crack at, you know, media or anything like that for not fully reporting. Items are never ever fully reported that we undertake and make decisions on here. So look, we've got to just make sure that through this hurdle, we are as transparent as possible. We get those people like PwC to make their statements, and the independent Chair of Audit to make her statements, because, you know, going forward, we're going to be discussing a budget that is just going to be looking so different to what anybody has ever imagined when it becomes public in the new year.
Thank you, Councillor. Finally, Councillor Henderson, and you're between us and lunch. So,
well, that's good. I shall be brief. I was planning to be anyway. Just to back up some of the kōrero here today, and I think well said, Chair and Mayor as well. Look, the ordinary person looks at these stories and sees, well, these guys are wanting to play around with the rates, levels of service, all that kind of stuff. But their policies cost us so much, maybe more than what they're asking for. So we've heard that that's not the case, but we're fighting a powerful argument. And I think we're right to feel aggrieved about it because it has actually made the kitchen tables of our communities. I'm getting people hitting me up in the about this. And that's awful. The other awful thing is that we're having to spend so long, with respect, discussing media commentary around this policy, which actually is very important. So, yeah, it's a shame that we've kind of had to go down this path, but here we are. And I'm hoping, and I'm really encouraged to hear that it's coming through our Auckland and we can actually translate that so that the general public get the facts. Thank you.
thank you, Deputy. Councillor Collins. Nope. Great. Well, in conclusion, I want to thank Alex very much for coming.
Is that working now?
Councillor Collins.
I beg your pardon, Chair. Thanks for the chance to speak. Hey, look, I just wanted to say that I've welcomed everyone's input today, but I still remain unclear and perhaps dissatisfied at the answers I've received over time since I first asked a question about the 270 limit, and that was back in March or April when we were first discussing the emergency budget and its impact, this debt ceiling impact on how that was going to be handled. And look, I understand that there are experts in front of the room at the moment, but I continue to be challenged by the idea that we are being challenged publicly to be daring, that we've been too timid not to set 300%. I heard what Councillor Coombe was saying about...
You're saying stuff that's been in confidential. You'd be very careful. I'm sorry.
No, I was making reference to the emergency budget when I asked about the 270 limit. And that was when I first asked about the 270 limit and questioned that.
Yeah, Councillor, I might just shut you down if that's possible. I'm sorry that we've done questions, and also I'm just concerned what you're saying, actually.
Can I just say then, Councillor?
Yes.
Yeah, and my apologies then if I have said anything that is that's been in relation to discussions that are confidential. My apologies, Chair, but I guess that's what I was getting at with, I know Councillor Coombe asked the question about the prudential limit is set, it says in the paper, at 270. I know there's the opportunity to perhaps come back to this later, and I listened carefully to what Councillor Fletcher was perhaps trying to suggest about deferring it. To that point, Chair, I'm going to be voting against on the basis that even without these refinements that the CEO has said can be looked at again and aren't major in nature, that this policy can be looked at. So that was the point I was trying to make. So my apologies again for saying anything that may have been out of line.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cooper?
It was just a question. I just wondered whether Councillor Collins was online when we had a very good presentation yesterday in the workshop from John Bishop about this very subject, which explicitly explained the whole thing, why we couldn't go beyond a certain point.
Yes, Chair, I was online and followed it up with a text conversation with him.
Okay. Look, I'm going to put the vote, but I want to make the point of saying thank you very much for Alex. We did need that independent advice. We do trust our staff, but it was really nice to have that extra independent advice, and I appreciate you taking the time and answering all the questions. So thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against?
Against.
Carried. Thank you. Do you want it noted, Councillor?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly try and do 11 and 12 so we can turn the Skype off. They are both just procedural items. Thank you. Do I have a seconder on item 12? Yep. Thank you, Councillor Mulholland. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. And finally, I will move us into confidential. No, summary of confidential decisions and related information. Moved by Councillor Walker, seconded by the Mayor. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Councillor. And I'll move into confidential. Do I have a mover for that?